and as usual, we're all gathered here today to listen to another exposition of the Lord Buddha's Dhamma. Before we commence today's sermon, let us all take a moment to reflect on how so extremely fortunate we are to be students of the Great Master, to be his disciples, to consider him our teacher, he who is the perfect one, the supremely enlightened one, the magnificent one, the omniscient one, the undefeated one, the incomparable one, the Samma Sambuddha. Before we commence today's sermon, let us take a moment then to pledge our allegiance to him as our teacher, to remind ourselves that there is no path other than the Noble Eightfold Path expounded by him for all sentient beings, including you and I, to achieve our liberation and our salvation. Reflecting on this fact, on this truth for a moment, let us take a moment to recite the Dhirasa Vigata Mohasa stanzas and pledge our allegiance to him as his disciples. So let us all be upstanding and you can all repeat, you can all recite the stanzas along with me. Dhirassa vigata mohassa abhinna khilassa vijita vijayassa anighassa susamachitassa buddha silassa sadhu panyassa vesantarassa vimalassa bhagavato tassa savako hamasmi akatanktissa tusitassa vantalokamissassa muditassa katasamanassa manujassa antima sarirassa narassa anopamassa virajassa bhagavato tassa savako hamasmi asansayassa kulassa venaikassa sarati varassa anuttarassa ruchira dhammassa nikhankassa pabhasakarassa manachidassa virassa bhagavato tassa savako hamasmi asansayassa kulassa venaikassa sarati varassa anuttarassa ruchira dhammassa nikhankassa abhasakarassa manachidassa virassa bhagavato tassa savako hamasmi namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa namo tassa bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. To observe the precepts and seek refuge in the Noble Triple Gem, please repeat all together and after me. Buddhang saranang gacchami, Dhammang saranang gacchami, Sanghang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi buddhang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi dhammang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi sanghang saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi buddhang saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi dhammang saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi sanghang saranang gacchami, Saranaгаmanang sampunnang, Panatipata veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami, Adinnadana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami, Kamesu Miccācara veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami, Musavada veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami, Suramere majjapama datthana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami, Tisaranena saddhing panchasilang dhammang sadhukang surakkhitam kattva appamadena sampadeta. Okay, you may all now be seated. To extend this opportunity to those who have always been by our side, to those who have always been there to help, support and assist us in this infinitely long journey that we have come in samsara. We do this by inviting them to join us wherever they may be in these 10,000 world systems. If they are within earshot of this preaching, may they join us and witness this, help them to redeem themselves from woeful planes, if they are today born in such places, and for all beings who are, may they all make use of this opportunity to attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. We must do this with gratitude from the bottom of our hearts, by reminding ourselves these are all beings who will have been mothers and fathers to us, who will have been family to us, friends, those who have helped us in difficult times, those who have been by our side in the tough times of our lives, not just once, not twice, but in this long journey in samsara many countless times. Therefore it is our duty, our obligation to extend this opportunity to them, to extend the gift that exceeds all gifts, the gift of Dhamma. So, as I now make this invitation I want you all to extend that invitation out in your hearts and in your minds to all of them. Invite them to join us, invite them to witness this meritorious deed and acquire merits. Invite them to rejoice in these merits. Invite them to listen to the teaching of the Buddha and attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. Samanta Chakravalesu Atra Gacchantu Devata Saddhammang Munirajassa Sunantu Sagga Mokkadang Dhamma Savana Kalu Ayang Bhadanta Dhamma Savana Kalu Ayang Bhadanta Dhamma Savana Kalu Ayang Bhadanta. In this long journey in samsara, we have not always been so generous. We have not always been so willing to extend a helping hand. The reason for this might have been that our associations have virtually always been with ignoble and immoral beings. Associations which defiled our minds with desire, aversion and delusion, and having been blinded with ignorance and attachment, thoughts, words and actions of revile, slander, desecration, insult and offense, we would have directed towards the noble triple gem, the noble ones. The consequences of such actions may be today that as we make efforts to achieve our salvation, this becomes an incredibly difficult task. So, having acknowledged the errors in our ways, having acknowledged that we need to change, that we have wronged in the past, having understood our errors, and promising ourselves never to conduct ourselves in such manner, let us all take a moment to seek forgiveness from the noble ones, the noble triple gem, the Samma Sambuddhas, the Pacceka Buddhas, Arahata Buddhas, Anagamis, Sakrudagamis, Sotapannas, be they on the path or having attained the fruits, as well as the Buddha's ministry, the Sambuddhashasana, for any thoughts, words or actions of revile, desecration, insult, slander or offense that we might have directed towards them. And let us all make a final resolve. May through the course of this sermon we be able to understand the Four Noble Truths, the teaching of all Buddhas, the perfect Dhamma expounded by the Perfect One, such that we are able to shut the gates to the hells once and for all, to free ourselves from that endless pit of suffering, and to embark on the Noble Eightfold Path, the only path there is to our liberation and salvation. And for any among you who may have already stepped on that path, let us take this opportunity to make a firm resolve that may through the course of this sermon we be able to fulfill the subsequent stages and attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. With that resolve in mind, I invite you all to prepare yourselves to listen to this teaching. Okay. I'm reminded that it's been a while since I made any mention of the importance of cutting out any distractions when you're listening to these sermons. It is important from time to time to remind you of this, clearly because there will always be distractions that will come from all around, particularly given the environments that you're in. So again, today let me remind you, what you're about to do is no easy feat. You're attempting to understand something that can only be understood in an era in which the Buddha's Dhamma prevails. So this is not an easy task. It's not like you've ever done this before. You may have tried, but each time various distractions would have hindered you. Do not allow another distraction to throw you off this opportunity to free yourself. These distractions can come in various shapes, sizes and forms. They can come in terms of inanimate objects. It can be your trusted mobile phone, or it could be your son or daughter. It could be a visitor. It could be the TV that's playing in the background. It could be various things. Or it might just be your pet cat who's just walked up to you for a cuddle. This is not the time for that. This is not the time to be sipping on some red wine and listening to the sermon. It's not the time for that. This is not the time to indulge in a popsicle. This is not the time for that. You may try it. You can only do one thing right. You know, I think, which one that is. So put aside all distractions. I'm only saying this because of compassion towards all of you. So put aside all distractions. Don't go to cuddle your pets. Don't go to hug your kids or pat them on the head. Do all that stuff before you listen to the sermon. But once you have sat down to listen to the sermon, you need 100% attention, 100% focus. If you need to attend to bodily needs, keep those distractions to a minimum. Because every distraction is going to throw you off the path, and it's going to be incredibly difficult to get yourself back on the path. I'll explain to you why that is. But first you must trust me. You must not allow any distractions to throw you off the path. The other distraction will of course be sleep. If you're feeling sleepy, that's one of the major distractions. You must know that by now. If you are habitually falling asleep during sermons on a Sunday afternoon around 2 o'clock, then perhaps that is because you've just had lunch. Perhaps that's because you stay up late on Saturday nights. Perhaps it's because you wake up in the early hours of a Sunday morning. Perhaps it's because it's your routine to hit the gym on a Sunday morning, and then by the time you get back home, you're exhausted, and then you get a wash, have some lunch, and sit down to listen to the sermon. You know now, do you know, that does not work? So where do you think the change needs to happen? What are you sacrificing? You got to plan your life around your Nibbana, folks. You always planned your life around various things, haven't you? As a young child, you planned your life, or as a baby, as an infant, you planned your life around sleep. That's the one thing that you did best. Remember? You did more hours of sleeping than anything else. So your life was planned around sleep. Then, as you got out of the cot, your life was planned around playtime. Then as you started to school, life started to be planned around education. That became the focus. Whenever you met someone, they would ask, "How you doing in school?" So that was what your life's focus was. Then as you grew older, it started to divert and diversify to various different things. For some of you it became sport. For some it became various hobbies. For some it became a girlfriend or a boyfriend. That became the focus of your life. And then further on, it started to narrow down and it started to focus around work, and then money, and then social status. See, always you had a focus area. Your life was planned around something else. Of course, they're all borrowed plans, as we talked about last week. But there was always a focus. There was something you were trying, your life was focused around. And then eventually, got married, and then your life started to focus around your spouse, and then your children, and then household life in general, then your cars, your estates, your wealth, becoming successful in your job, getting the next promotion. Let me know if you don't agree with me. Weren't these the focus areas in your life? For some of you, around this time came an opportunity to migrate. Then the focus of your life became wherever you wanted to migrate to. Some faraway land. That was the focus of your life. Everything you did, every waking moment of your life, you spent thinking about that. For some of you it worked out, for others it didn't. Once you got there, then again the same routine continued. Various things became the focus of your life. After a while, retirement became the focus of your life. Usually happens late 40s, early to late 40s. When you've passed the peak of your life, when it's all started to go downhill from there on. Midlife crisis for some. And that became the focus of your life. Ask yourself, what is the focus of your life today? What is your focus of your life right now? Like focusing the lens of a camera to capture whatever object you're interested in as much detail as possible. In a similar fashion, do you not focus your life on an object? And that object is usually one of the things that I just talked about. Retirement, and then later on, moving out of the busy life of the busy schedules of your life and into a retirement home for some people, and settling down and waiting for shutdown. That became the focus of your life. Funeral plans became usually the focus towards the end of life. or sometimes it can be treatment for various ailments. For most people, that's the last focus of life. And then it's all onto the deathbed, and that's the end of that story. Seldom does one divert from this track, this age-old beaten track. So I'm asking you, where is your focus? For the extremely fortunate who come across the Dhamma, if they're fortunate enough to have listened to the Dhamma, to have come across a Kalyana Mitra, and have understood the Dhamma, then all that focus is recalibrated, and then Nibbana becomes the focus. Various things will come to take away your focus, just like your focus was distracted by other things when you had mundane objects as your center of focus. Right? Remember when you were in school, during your education, did your parents not always warn you, don't take your mind off your studies, because that is what's important now. Affairs is not what you need to do now, that's going to come later in your life. Playing games is not what should take focus of your life. Focus on your education. Do you remember your parents used to tell you that? And then your boss used to tell you, your projects, your deadlines, that has to be your focus. Again, after all, borrowed plans. Be that a borrowed plan or your own plan, there's always a focus in your life. And I'm asking you, make sure that your focus now is around Nibbana. So, plan your weekends accordingly, folks. To be honest, you don't need me to be saying this to you by now. If you are a regular listener to these sermons, you will probably know by now that when you sit down to listen to this sermon at 2 o'clock, 2:15, you start to feel a bit tipsy. 2:30, you grab your water bottle to try and make one last effort to stay awake. 2:45, you get up and start walking up and down, and then usually around 3 o'clock, you lose all sense of time. And then someone comes and wakes you up and says, Ami, the sermon's over. That's when you know the sermon's over. Perhaps it's time to reschedule your Sundays. If that's, of course, these sermons are important to you. One thing I believe in, though, is if something's worth doing, it's worth doing it right. Otherwise, stop doing it. If you want to do something, do it right. Otherwise, try and focus on something else and do that right, whatever that might be. So, perhaps it's time to start rescheduling your Sundays, your weekends. Maybe staying up late on a Saturday night is not a good plan after all. It's not a good idea after all. Perhaps that is why Sunday afternoons are a terrible time to listen to the sermons. You might perhaps suggest, Swami Hansa, can we please reschedule them to a different time of the week? Okay, what if I did that? Wouldn't there always be someone else who will have a problem with that particular time? So, there's no right or wrong with this from my point of view, but I think from your perspective, if this is important to you, then perhaps you need to reschedule your weekends such that when you sit down for the sermon, you're wide awake, you're alert, you have 100% focus, and your body is agreeing with what your mind wants to do. Okay? So, sleep is a huge distractor. Feeling sleepy, it's partly to do with your physical fitness, so sometimes there's little you can do about it. Maybe you need to change your diet. Perhaps you're accustomed to having a heavy lunch on a Sunday afternoon. Maybe that's what needs to change. Perhaps you'll need to settle for a sandwich and cut out the heavy meal on a Sunday afternoon. Maybe switch it to Sunday evening for dinner. Thereby you're prepared, physically fit, apt to listen to the sermon. These are small changes that you can make, but will have a big impact. So, some practical suggestions there. To try out. Maybe for some of you, what will work is maybe if you can get a quick nap an hour before the sermon. If you know the sermon starts at 2 o'clock, perhaps an hour after lunch, get a nap, so you're alert, you're awake, and sleep doesn't become the killer distractor. Somehow you need to get out of the grasp of Mara during the sermon. That's what you need to aim to do. Sleep is when Mara starts to play games with you. So really, Mara is in bed with you when you start falling asleep, particularly during a sermon. Okay, so some practical tips and suggestions there. Maybe you have a beverage that can keep you up. Perhaps it's a coffee. Maybe you need to take that coffee 15 minutes before the sermon, and that keeps you awake and alert during the sermon. I don't know, it's different things for different people. But whatever your circumstances are, I'm suggesting take a moment to just examine your schedule, and if Sunday afternoons is a difficult time for you to be alert, for whatever reason that might be, maybe reschedule your Sundays, replan your Sundays so that you can listen to the sermon well and understand it. If you have listened to last week's sermon, that we are starting to talk about some heavy stuff. It's only heavy until you understand it. It's not heavy after that. How heavy is addition, subtraction, multiplication and division? It's only heavy until you understand it. Once you get your head around it, then it's easy peasy. But to get your head around it, you need to be awake. You need to be alert, and you need to keep your focus. So, be that sleep or various other distractions, put them all aside and try and focus on today's sermon to get the most out of it. Okay? So, try and adhere to that advice as much as you possibly can. It is for your own good. I expect from you that you will have taken my advice and watched or listened at least to last week's sermon at least 1 or 2 times. I would also expect that perhaps only 10% or 5% of what we talked about really made sense to you. That is also something I expect. So you can rest assured then that my expectation is not that you understood 90% of it and only 10% you're struggling with. My expectation is that you probably understood 5% of it and 95% of it you're struggling with. So fear not. My job, my duty to you is to help you make sense of that which you have yet to make sense. So I'll help you with that. Okay? I'll help you with that, not to worry. Don't let that upset you. If you haven't understood some bits and pieces, it's fine. Don't let that frustrate you. Okay? Because what we will do is, including today and upcoming sermons, we will talk about what we have been trying to focus on the last couple of weeks in more detail and break it down to you and make it as simple as possible, so that every soul listening to this sermon with intent, with focus and with purpose will be able to understand it without a problem. That much I can promise you. As I always tell you, if I can do this, you can do it. If I can understand this, you can understand this. Because after all there is cause and effect. There is no you to understand it, there is no me to understand it. Cause and effect is all we are trying to get in line here. Let's go back to what we talked about last week then. I'm going to share the screen with you and bring up what we discussed last week. Okay. So this is a screen from last week. I think you can all see the screen okay. Alright. Let me walk you through this, and if we need to, I will draw I'll make a few more sketches so that you can follow through. Right. We started off on the top left hand side of the board. I think you can see what I'm pointing at, can't you? Let me just check that. Yes, alright. So you can. We started with what we already know about how our mind operates. I talked about the 5 senses. This is not new. This is stuff you should already know. The purpose of the 5 senses is to help our minds to sense the world around us. The eye, ear, nose, tongue and body. Sight, sound, smells, taste and touch. They come in through the 5 sense doors into the mind. The mind, of course, we know is self-sufficient. So in the absence of sensory inputs from these 5 senses, the mind can quite happily trot along without any bother, because the mind can feed itself in the absence of all the other senses. So even when the mind is in a coma, or a person's in a coma, the mind is still feeding itself. Okay? Now, what I explained to you is, I remember I gave you the analogy of a visitor that comes and knocks on your door. So that you can see up here. So you're at home, person comes knocking on your door. You don't know that a person's on your porch until you hear the knock. Isn't that right? You don't know that someone's at your door until you hear the knock. You'll be busy doing whatever you're doing at home. When you hear the knock, that's when you know someone's at the door. You don't know who's at the door, you just know someone's at the door. What you'll do next is walk up to the door, you'll open the door, and you will examine the person. For what purpose? To recognize them, to identify them. Once you've done that, the next thing on your mind is, how do I deal with this person? Depending on who the person is, you will have to make a choice as to how you deal with this person. Do I ask him to go away? Do I ask him or her to come in, take a seat, or do I ask, what is it you want? Right? So how you treat the person will depend on your identification of the person. This is all basic stuff, right? Nothing difficult here. So this is an analogy, and I'll help relate that to the 5 aggregates. Let's stop there for a moment and try and relate that story to the 5, or at least the first 4 of the 5 aggregates. Rupa is the object that comes into the mind. That Rupa comes from a sight, a sound, smell, taste, touch, or a Dhamma. That should probably be a D for Dhamma. That comes into the mind. So that's what you see here as the subscript. Rupa, Rupa, Shabda, Rupa, Gandha, Rupa, Rasa, Rupa, Sparsha, Rupa, and Dhamma, Rupa. These are the mental objects. Objects that come into the mind. From the analogy, this is the visitor that visits and is on your porch. You don't know, though, that a Rupa has come into the mind until Vedana does its job. That's the letter V here. This is your notification. This is your alert. This is letting you know that you have a visitor. So from the analogy, what is it? Is it the door? Is it the porch? What is it? That's the knock. So when you hear the knock, that's when you know someone's at the door, right? So that's your Vedana. It is to inform you that something's happening, something's happened, or something is happening. Then you have Sanya. What did we do after we heard the knock? You walked up to the door, you opened the door, and you looked at the person to identify them. That is Sanya, identification. Giving it a name, giving this Rupa a name, giving it a label, recognizing it. That's the function of Sanya. So these are functions that happen in the Chitta. This is what goes on in your mind. We've talked about this in the past, but I appreciate there may be new listeners who might not have been with us in the previous sermons. So it's all good reminder, refresher rather. Once we identified them, our next step was to decide on how we greet them, how we deal with them essentially. And that could be, 2 of the options we might have is, hey, come on in. Oh, hey, what do you want? So that could be 2 of the options. Likewise, there's an action that the mind will relate to the Rupa. Vedana, Sanya and Sankara, they are all to detail the Rupa. So they have a direct relationship to this Rupa. Vedana is to notify that the Rupa has arrived. Identification is to identify the Rupa. Sankara, or the actions, is to determine what action can be taken with this Rupa. It's very akin to receiving a visitor or a guest at home. Okay, and then finally we came to Vijnana, which is aptly, we decided to name it perception. The best way I can describe this to you in this analogy is, imagine the visitors come and gone, and perhaps the visitor, you've just had a visitor, and then you decide to inform a friend or perhaps your spouse that you've just had a visitor. So maybe you'll ring your wife, your husband, or someone and say, hey, guess what happened? Guess what just happened? And they're like, what happened? I was busy at home doing something, then I heard a knock on the door, then I walked up to the door and opened the door, and I found Sam at the door, and I invited him to come in and take a seat, and now he's in our living room. So that's a story that you have just related. Do you see that the story is made up of all of the above parts? It includes the Rupa, that is the visitor. It includes the Rupa. It includes the notification. It includes the knock. That's why I said in the story that you related, you just said, I was busy at home and then I heard a knock on the door. So that story includes the notification. It includes the fact that you identified the person as being Sam. So that's part of the story. And then it also includes what you did with the person, what you did with Sam, inviting him to come in, take a seat, and so that's part of the actions. This is all sankhara. So the aggregate of all this, the rupa, vedana, sanya, sankhara, you get your vijnana. So vijnana is what wraps the whole picture. You know, they say a picture speaks 1,000 words. Vijnana does the same job. It is the aggregate of the above elements, and its function is to give the complete picture of that rupa which just arrived, and what and how the mind dealt with that rupa. Okay, so I think that's pretty clear now, and if problems still remain, then you can always either go back and listen to previous sermons, or you can, if problems still remain, please feel free to send us any questions you have, and we'll try and answer them when possible and when appropriate. So all that's fine. Now, is there any problem with this process? Is this process does this process bring us any misery? Is there any problem with this process? The answer is no. How do we know that? Because we always compare any problem that we have with our baseline. So we have a baseline to compare with, and that is the mind of an arahant. We know for a fact that this happens in the mind of an arahant. Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara and Vijnana is nothing new to the mind of an arahant. So, but an arahant has no suffering, and if suffering is what we are trying to address here, then we have no problem to address with Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara and Vijnana. I then drew this out on this curve that you can see on screen, which we fondly refer to as our little sine curve of arising and passing away. I reminded you that each of these curves is a chitta. So you'll see 1, 2, 3 chittas on screen, and the beginning of the fourth, so 3.5 chittas on screen you see here, and the arising and passing away. With the arising of the chitta, the Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara, Vijnana arises, and it passes away along with the passing away of it. In whose mind? This is the mind of an arahant. I then made reference to one of our previous sermons where I quite liked the fact that we liked how we were able to capture the problem scenario in terms of someone and something. We have always seen a problem with something until, of course, we come to face the Dhamma. We've always seen a problem with something. That's what we've always complained about. Some things. By that I don't mean, someone being somebody else and then we complain about someone. There's still some things. Let me explain what I mean there. What are some of the things you have complained in your life about? You'll complain about the weather. You'll complain about work. You'll complain about school. You'll complain about homework. You'll complain about your colleagues. You'll complain about politics and the economy. These are all some things, right? Among that will be someone's also, but it's not the same someone I'm talking about here. If you're complaining about, say, a friend of yours or someone who's borrowed some money off of you and is not returning it, that's again a something. So please make that distinction. I'm not referring to a third party as a someone. All third parties is a something. In other words, these are the some things that happen in your life. The some things can happen as a result of an inanimate object making an impact on your life, or it can be a living thing making an impact on your life. So this something can actually be a physical, lifeless entity, or it could be an actual person or an animal. Okay? All of that is in the something category. So what's the someone then? The someone is who observes or experiences the some things happening in their life. That's who feel is going through the experience of life. Right? So when you say, I'm living life, there's always an I who's living it. That's the someone, the I who's living it. Okay? Imagine driving in a car and looking out the window. You'll see lots of things going past you. Among them will be, shops and houses and trees and various other things. You'll also see people. Right? You might see a friend and wave at them. Right? These are all some things. But who's going through that experience? Who's in the car? That's the someone. That is the someone I'm referring to here. So it's you, who you feel is going through the experience of the some things that are happening in your life. Is that clear? Okay. So that's someone and that's something. Now, this Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana, tell me, so these are rhetorical questions, I want you to think about these things. Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana, what does that relate to of these two things? Is it to do with the someone or is it to do with something? Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana, someone or something? So that is to do with the something. Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana is the some things that happen to someone. That is why when we plotted it on this curve here, the 5 aggregates or an instance of the 5 aggregates arise and pass away. That's why I've labeled here some things, right? You see here, this sine curve that's labeled as a something. That's arising and passing away. You'll then recall that I drew another line just below this sine curve, and prior to that I reminded you that when we talk about suffering, we know that suffering comes primarily in 2 forms: fear and grief, also called sorrow. We know from previous sermons and from life lessons that fear is something we experience about something that is already in our possession. So this is the something again I'm referring to. This something, when something is already in our possession, that's when we experience fear. Let's take a couple of examples. Do you fear losing the watch you don't have? That question in itself does not make any sense, right? You can't fear losing something you don't have. Fear is, after all, losing out. It's missing out on something, losing something. You can't miss out or lose out on something that you don't already have. So when we talk about fear, we are always talking about something that is already in your possession and what might happen to you in the event that you lose possession of that object. That object is always a something that can be a lifeless thing or it can be a living thing. Is that clear to you? So, as I said, have you ever feared losing the watch that you don't have? That does not make sense. You can only fear losing the watch that you have. Can you fear losing a parent that you have already lost? So imagine you lost your mother 6 years ago. Can you fear losing your mother? No, you would have already gone through that experience. So if that happened 6 years ago, then perhaps 5 years and 11 months prior to now, so maybe a month before, say in the last month of her life, something terrible happened and that was the last month that she was able to live. If that was the case, right, in that last month, that month was probably when you experienced fear at its peak, at its greatest, in relation to your mother. What if you lost a pet? Right? You had a puppy and something happened, say it contracted some sort of illness, and the dog died. If that had happened, you would have experienced fear a day, a week, a moment before the unfortunate event. You can't fear about something you have already lost. In other words, you can't fear something that is not at the moment of observation in your possession. At the moment in the moment you're making this observation that I fear, you can't be talking about something you don't already have in your possession, or something that was in your possession and you have lost. That's all making sense to you, I hope, right? And then what about grief? The opposite. Grief is something that you can experience any amount of time after you lost your mother. So if that happened 6 years ago, 6 years on from that event, perhaps as I'm reminding you about it now, grief still comes into your mind. It's not fear, that is grief. Is it not? So grief is something you experience about something you have lost, something that is not in your possession, however, something you wished was in your possession. You would not experience grief about having lost something that you wanted to lose. You wanted to get rid of. You don't have grief about the headache that you had this morning, which you don't have now. You don't go, oh shucks, I don't have that headache I had this morning. What a pity. You don't say like that, because you never wanted that headache to linger on. You wanted to get rid of it. However, do you not fear a headache? That can happen so what I mean by fearing a headache is, you say at a time when you don't have a headache, so you're headache free, you don't have a headache. Let's imagine now may be a good time for that. You don't have a headache right now. Do you not fear losing that comfort of not having a headache? Why? Because you don't have a headache now. In other words, you're in possession of the experience of not having a headache. Therefore, you fear. That's what you say, I fear I fear catching a cold. What you're really saying is, you're not fearing the cold. You're fearing losing the comfort of not having a cold. Fear is always to do with something that is already in your possession. Grief is to do with something that is no longer in your possession, something you have already lost. Okay? When we talk about the world, it has to be either something that is present or something that is not present. That is why I wanted to explain to you the clear distinction between fear and grief. And the important thing to take away from here is, having something or not having something makes no difference to whether you are suffering or not, if you are attached to it. Let me repeat that. When we talk about things in the world, anything, that could be absolutely anything. So I'm just going to put a question mark. That could be absolutely anything. If it's something to do with worldly possessions, so that can be a sight, a sound, a smell, taste, or a touch. It can be the actual eye, ear, nose, tongue, or the body. Okay, it could be the Dhamma. So ultimately it could be Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, and Vijnana. These are all some things. So I'm trying to again help you link all these things together. That's when this web, when it all starts to link together, that's when you get that eureka moment. Aha, now that makes sense. So I'm trying to help you draw references from various angles, and the way the mind works is, just say there's 50 of you listening to the sermon. Chances are each of you will have understood an aspect of this sermon in more detail than other aspects. So perhaps someone understands Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana better than the arising and passing away phenomenon. Someone understands the fear, grief situation better than the Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankhara Vijnana situation. Right? So my role here as a teacher during this sermon is to help you draw references among the various elements of this sermon so that it all starts to make sense in your mind. Okay? So that is why I'm going over this again and helping you bridge the gaps, if you like. So let's come back to what I was talking about there. When we talk about something, it is to do with something that is worldly. In Nibbana there is nothing. So once you have passed away into Parinibbana, the mind has there is no mind, full stop. So no amount of Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankhara Vijnana can be received because there is no mind. That is after Parinibbana, right? So in Nibbana, nothing exists. Existence only happens in the world. Even as an Arahant, the mind exists and the five aggregates exist, but after an Arahant passes away into Parinibbana, this is the Anupadisesa Nirvana, nothing exists. Okay? What you need to understand though, to get your head around, is not what it's like after Parinibbana. What you need to get your head around is there is nothing of essence that exists. That is what's going to help you get to Parinibbana, not what it's like to know what's after Parinibbana. That's not what you need to know right now. There is nothing of essence to cling on to attach to. Once you've understood that, that is the entrance to Sopadisesa Nirvana. Anupadisesa Nirvana will happen automatically. You don't need to worry about that. So when we talk about something to do that is worldly, be that a physical object, or when we talk about the mind, the five aggregates, we are talking about something that is present or absent. When something's present and there is attachment to it, this is really important. When there's attachment to it, with no attachment, we can't talk about this. Without attachment, all of this makes little sense. So when there's attachment to whatever the case might be, there's a form of suffering. That's fear if you're talking about something that's present, or it's grief if you're talking about something that is not in your possession. All on board? Excellent. Now, that being the case, we know then that having or not having something does not really make you happy. That is why the Buddha does not talk about the cause of suffering as being the presence of things in this world, or the absence of things in this world. But what do most people think the cause of suffering is? Not having what they want, right? What is the Buddha's teaching as to the cause of suffering? He talks about attachment. He doesn't talk about not having what you want is the cause of suffering. He says wanting. Wanting is the cause of suffering. So that is to do with attachment, right? So what we did then is, going back to this sine curve above, on this curve I plotted these little dots. Now you can see these little dots here on the peaks and the troughs, right, alternatingly. These are points where the five aggregates, or the instance of the five aggregates, are either present or absent. This is in its simplest form. They're either present or absent. So, for example, at this point here, right at the start of this curve, it's absent. What's absent? This instance of the five aggregates. So that might have been, say, a flower that you've seen. Right? So that's absent. So that came in through the eye in the form of Rupa. The alert, notification, that's the Vedana. Identification, that's the Sanya. Sankhara, which is the action. And finally, the story, the perception. The perception of the entire event. That came in and dropped on the mind as an instance of the five aggregates. Before it came in, that was not there. So therefore, but there was still attachment to it. In other words, you wanted it, but it wasn't there. Therefore grief. When it lands on the mind, You want it, and now it's there. So what do we have here? Going back to this portion of the chart, what do you see? When it's in your possession and you want it, you have fear. So that's what is here. That's fear here. When you want it and you don't have it, how does it go from having it to not having? Well, of course, the passing away. The arising and passing away. Anicca looks after that. The arising, passing away. So that's cause and effect. Why did it arise? Because there were causes which brought it to life. Why did it pass away? Because the causes passed away. That's how arising and passing away happens. Okay? So when it passed away, again, this is something that you want, something that you're attached to, and therefore there's grief. And then again there's arising. Now you have something that you want, therefore what the mind experiences at this point is fear. Is this clear to you? I really want you to get your heads around this. Alright, let's take this chitta, isolate it on its own. This is number 2, chitta number 2, right? The chitta that I have demarcated using these vertical lines. This is a chitta that is arising and passing away. At either end, you don't have it. You don't have what? The 5 aggregates. Because the chitta has not yet arisen. And then when it arises, there is now the opportunity for the 5 aggregates, or an instance of the 5 aggregates to come and land on the mind, on the chitta. That comes from the outside world. The mind happens, the chittas arise on the inside. Okay? So when it lands, you've gone from not having to having. From not being in your possession to being in your possession. By your, I mean the mind. So therefore, if the chitta, or if the mind, let's say, is attached to this instance of the aggregates, then at the moment where it's not present, you have grief. At the moment it is present, you have fear. Going by what we talked about earlier. You can only be fearful of losing something you already have. You can only experience grief when you don't have, when you have lost possession, or when you don't have possession of something that you want. Hence grief and fear. Do you see then how in the cause of one chitta you're going to have at least 2 instances of grief and fear. If you consider either side, you have 2 instances of grief and 1 of fear. This is in its very simplest form. I also talked about last week about how there is not actually a single point on this line where there is no grief and fear, but we'll talk about that later. So for the time being, there is not a single point on this line where you can pinpoint and go, aha, there, we don't have any grief or fear. It doesn't work like that. So you have grief and fear, right? Now, what we did after that was we plotted a separate graph just below that line, and we just mirrored the points of grief and fear on this line. So we just extracted the grief points and the fear points. These are these points here. You see the G, the F, the fear points and the grief points. This might sound very mathematical, very analytical. I'm just trying to help you visualize this. It'll all make sense to you. I'll help you to relate this in a more personal way. But if you can get your head around the theory first, then as we start to talk about practical examples, it'll all start to make sense. I can talk about the practical examples first, but if you don't understand the theory, if you don't understand the mechanics of this, then you will struggle. That's why I'm trying to, as perhaps dry as this might seem, or as perhaps analytical and very scientific, even mathematical as this might seem, it's not really. This is very simple. Yes, there's a chart on the screen, but it's really simple. There's nothing complicated about this. This is so simple. Yeah, a 6-year-old can get this, I promise you. So grief, fear, grief. Where are these coming from? Each chitta that is arising and passing away. What we've done here is we've pointed, or we've marked on this line the points along the time axis, this is something that happens over the course of time, the span of time, the points of grief and fear. Okay? What we did then was we plotted a line across these points, and we ended up with a straight line. This straight line is, as the name says, it's a straight line. It's not a line that is wavy. It's not a curve that arises and passes away. It's a straight line. For those of you who might have done some, math or physics, will recall, when you have a straight line, that usually denotes that something is steady. A straight line denotes that something is steady. It's not changing. Okay? So, for example, if you put on the gas and you heat something and you put the thermometer in the substance you're trying to heat, you'll normally see a curve that is inclining. So it'll keep going up, which means over time the temperature increases. But if you have, for instance, say your car, and you're driving along the road and you want to plot time versus speed, if I were to draw a line like this, what does that tell you? It tells you that, say this is 50 kmph. Okay, this is the speed axis, this is the time axis. This tells you that over the span of this time, if that was say 1 hour, you drove at a speed of 50 kilometers per hour. That's a straight line, by the way. Okay, thus you drove at a speed of 50 kilometers per hour. If that line was something like this, then you know that over time your speed increased from near about 0 to some point, let's say that was 80, right? And then if I continued that line like this, you know that after 1 hour the speed started to reduce. And what if you increased again? Then it would go up again, and then reduced again, goes down again. You get the picture, right? But if it's a straight line, you know that you maintained steady speed. So if you want to denote something that is steady, something that is unchanging, you use a straight line. That is why, to really get that idea, that concept into your mind, is why I'm really drawing a graph here. Excuse me. It's not to complicate things. It's only to get that point into your head. We are talking about something that is steady, something that is apparently unchanging, something that is apparently permanent. And what that something is what I'm trying to help you figure out. So you've got a steady line here, and the only thing it seems that we can plot on a steady line, on a straight line rather, is grief and fear. Can we plot the Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vinyana on a steady line? What do you think? Or a straight line. Can we plot the 5 aggregates whose arising and passing away? Can we plot it on a straight line? Can we? No, because if you wanted to show that they're rising and passing away, you can't plot it on a straight line. It's going to be a sine curve like this. If you wanted to show the arising and passing away of the chitta, again it can't be a straight line. It's going to be a curve like this. But if you wanted to show this, if you want to show if we were able to show that something lay on a straight line, then that has to be something that remains unchanging. Now that which remains unchanging, as you can see, is suffering in its 2 forms. You might say, well, hang on, Swaminatha, isn't that grief and isn't this fear? How can you say it's not changing? I agree. Yes, and then it changes to grief again, and then to fear again. Yes, that much I agree. But collectively, what do you call these things? What's the common word for grief and fear? That's suffering, isn't it? So if there was anything that remained steady while the five aggregates arose and passed away in the mind, if there was anything that remained static, anything that remained fixed, anything that remained steady and unchanging, you must be able to understand now. You should be able to understand now that that could only be fear and grief. Collectively, we call it suffering. Okay, so what? Is a very important question to be asking at this point. Yes, okay, we get that, right? The five passing away, arising and passing away in the mind, but the grief and fear, that's on a steady line. Yeah, so what's the point? What are you trying to get at, Swaminathan? This is where I want you to remember the little exercise I asked you to do. The someone and the something exercise. When you closed your eyes and I asked you to go back into your childhood and you were able to recall that you were present back in your childhood, that it was not a different you, it was just you all along. Your sense of I, your sense of self has remained unchanged from childhood to the present day. And you have no reason to believe why it should change from the present into the future. So your sense of self remains unchanged. What changes is the something. Right? So when you change something. You don't change. The something around you changes, but you don't change. Now, isn't that what isn't that the case? Would you all agree with me there? Right? Something changes, but the someone who's going through the experience of the changing something, the ever-evolving something, someone remains fixed, someone remains static. The presence of a self, the notion of a self, the feeling of a self, the perception of a self, right? I'm trying to put this in every different shape and word I can think of to help you click onto something, or someone rather. I want you to get an idea of what this someone I'm talking about. It's you feeling that you are present. The sense of an I. Right? That has remained fixed, that has remained steady, that has remained unchanging throughout your life. You don't need to go back into your previous lives and ask what happened back then. Forget previous lives. Forget your next birth. Just think about this birth. Right? If you can understand what I'm trying to explain here, folks, you do not need to then from there on, there is no reason why you ought to think that it's birth, rebirth is the cause of suffering. There's no reason for you to think, I'm going to die and then I'm going to be born in the hell and that is suffering. Isn't that what, where a lot of people get stuck? A lot of people don't believe in reincarnation. They don't believe that there was a previous birth. They don't believe that there's an afterbirth. And so they say, I completely disregard Buddhism because all it talks about is rebirth and afterbirth. Life afterbirth. It talks about reincarnation. On that basis, I reject Buddhism. Little do they know that the Buddha's talking about rebirth is not really that. He's talking about a different kind of rebirth. He's not talking about, he has on various instances talked about reincarnation, but the reincarnation that he's talking about is not you being born after your physical death. When he talks about previous birth, seldom does he talk about your previous birth in terms of what happened to you before your physical body came into being. In other words, were you a monkey before you became a human? Or are you going to be a deva after you die? These are some of the places where people completely fail foul, and they completely fail, and they think that Buddhism it makes no sense. You got to believe things that you can't prove, and then they disregard it. That's because they've completely lost the plot. That is not what the Buddha is talking about. Certainly not in the absolute sense. Here he talks about rebirth, indeed, but now I'm trying to show you what he means by rebirth. Right? I'm trying to show you what he means by rebirth. And of course, we must stop rebirth. But I don't believe in rebirth, Swaminatha. So how can I stop something that I don't believe in? I'm trying to show you that there is no way you can not believe in rebirth. Because rebirth can be proved now. Reincarnation can be proved. All it requires is some logic and the ability to understand logic, the ability to reason. This is very scientific. This is very logical. There's plenty of rationale behind all of these things. There is absolutely nothing you need to believe through blind faith in Buddhist philosophy. I can prove to you that rebirth exists. Because what we mean by rebirth is not you dying and being born as something else. We're not talking about your physical death that might happen at the age of 85. That's not the rebirth we are talking about here. Something else is being reborn. Do you not see that on this curve, on this graph? Something's being reborn. Every moment, something's being reborn. It's not the 5 aggregates. We are talking about rebirth being suffering. Rebirth is suffering. But what is this birth we are talking about here? The birth of suffering is what we are talking about here. This is what we talk about in terms of jati, which I wrote up here on screen. You see? That jati, which you will recall from the dependent origination process, the dependent origination of what? Indeed, the dependent origination of suffering. That is what we always talked about. Dependent origination of suffering. That is why the Buddha talked about dependent origination. See, he's talking about the dependent origination of suffering. Why? So you can learn it and sit an exam? No, he's trying to show you, or he's trying to show us rather, that suffering is dependent on a number of factors. Does he not give us the problem and the answer at the same time? He's saying suffering is dependent on a number of factors, and he gives us those factors. Does that not leave the person who's just took on that teaching the choice? Does that not present the person who's just taken on that teaching the choice of doing away with those causes, doing away with those dependencies, and therefore freeing themselves from suffering once and for all? Right? So let me show you now then that this jati, or rebirth if you want to call it that, is suffering. This is the same as suffering. This is suffering. Jati, rebirth, suffering, self, I, they can all be used interchangeably. Come back to this graph here. Grief and fear, grief and fear, grief and fear. That's never ending. When I say never, I mean for as long as attachment exists. Because without attachment, you can't talk about fear or grief. Right? Tanhai vipamuttassa nati soko kuto bhayam. Without attachment, there is no room for fear or grief. So, you know then the moment I start to plot fear and grief here, I'm talking about a mind which is not void of attachment. So, attachment looms. So therefore fear and grief exists. Right? Now when the 5 aggregates arise and pass away in this mind, which is the some things that happen in life, the someone appears to be born. How so? Attachment brings about grief and fear. When you plot grief and fear along this line, what you get is, or when you simply plot fear and grief, what you get at the end of the day is a straight line. Meaning it's a steady flow. Meaning it's permanent. Meaning it's always been there. The one thing that you have always sensed as always being there is a self. That is the I. Now do you see how that is what rebirth is talking about? That is what jati is. It's really misinterpreting suffering. Self is a misinterpretation of suffering. Misinterpretation because that in itself is ignorance. Ignorance is the misinterpretation of suffering. Considering suffering to be self, that is ignorance. Let me again take you back to that story when those Brahmins went and met the Buddha and asked him, where do we find the self, Venerable Gautama? Is it in the Rupa, the Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana? What did the Buddha ask? What was the Buddha's response to that question? You're asking the wrong question. See, you must see now that it is indeed the wrong question to be asking. How can fear and grief be anything to do with Rupa? Because if that were the case, what should always be true? What should also be true? If fear and grief are to do with Rupa, what should also be true? A mind which has pure Rupa and no attachment should also experience fear and grief, shouldn't it? If fear and grief are the products of Rupa, then a mind in which Rupa exists without any other factors, such as attachment, should also experience fear and grief. Does that happen? No. How do we know? That is an arahant, in whose mind there is no attachment. But is the mind of an arahant free of the five aggregates? Of course not. How else would an arahant be able to see, or smell, or taste, or touch, or think? These things happen in the mind of an arahant because seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, and hearing are not things that happen due to attachment. You don't need attachment for any of those things. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking are not the products of attachment. They are the products of the mind, or the chittas, and the five aggregates which arise and pass away with the chittas. You don't need attachment for that. Well, what do you need attachment for then? What is the only thing that attachment can bring you? In other words, what one thing, if you wanted, would you have to have attachment with you? That, of course, is suffering. If you wanted suffering, you're going to have attachment. You can't come empty-handed and say, can I have some suffering, please? We're going to have to ask you, show us attachment and we'll give you suffering. It's like, walking into a shop and saying, can I have a loaf of bread? The shopkeeper is going to say, show me your money and I'll give you bread. Likewise, if you want suffering, you're going to have to come prepared with attachment. Without attachment, we can't give you suffering. And when you come with attachment, we can't let you leave without suffering. Because they go hand in hand. Wherever there is attachment, there's always suffering. Wherever there is suffering, there's always attachment. So one does not exist without the other. Okay? But would it be right for me to say, wherever there's attachment, there's seeing. Wherever there's attachment, there's tasting. That doesn't even make any sense. For you to be able to smell something, you need attachment. Does that make sense? For you to be able to hear something, you need attachment. How did the Buddha see things then? Through attachment? How did the Buddha see things, smell things, taste things, touch things? All these sensory inputs came into the Buddha's mind, no problem, but his mind was entirely rid of attachment. So you got to see then that attachment and the sensory inputs, in other words, the mind perceiving what's going on in the outside world, has nothing to do with attachment. Put that in big bold letters in your mind, across your mind. Attachment has nothing to do with perceiving the outside world. Nothing, absolutely nothing. You don't need attachment to survive. You don't need attachment to live. What do you need attachment for? To suffer. If you want suffering, that's what you need attachment for. Okay? So, going back to the chart here, the graph here, you'll see the 5 aggregates arising and passing away. Meaning, this is a mind which can see things, smell things, taste things, touch things, and think things. Right? Is that not the case? Can this mind not see, smell, taste, touch, and think things? Of course it can. How so? Well, because it is able to receive the 5 aggregates. What else is this mind able to do? You can't answer that until I tell you it's also got attachment. Okay, it has no attachment. What else is this mind able to do? The answer is nothing. A mind is able to arise. What can it do? The answer is nothing. The mind is able to arise and pass away. Now what can it do? Okay, now it can see things and smell things and taste things and touch things and think things. Okay, and what else can it do? The answer is nothing. The mind is able to arise and pass away and it's also got attachment. Now what can it do? Now it can see things and smell things and taste things and touch things and think things, and it can suffer. What was the additional factor which allowed you to suffer? Attachment. I'm trying to show you in every different form I can that attachment has only everything to do with suffering and nothing to do with anything else. Get that clearly in your minds. You absolutely need to get that straight in your heads. Attachment has everything to do with suffering and nothing to do with anything else. Okay? So for suffering to exist, the prerequisite is attachment, and when attachment is there, suffering is inevitable. They go hand in hand. Okay? So the mind arising and passing away, that just happens as it does in the mind of the 5 arising in the mind that arises and passes away. That happens as in the mind of an arahant. But when there's attachment, fear and grief come into the picture, and fear and grief does not arise and pass away. So you might ask, well, hang on, Swaminatha, there's grief here, but there's no grief when there's fear. And then there's grief again. So didn't that arise and pass away? Yes, but what I want you to understand is take the two together and we've got suffering. So I'm talking about suffering in common terms. So when you have suffering, that's the little s here, right? That's suffering. This is also suffering. So suffering has prevailed forever. Forever long as what? Forever long as attachment has prevailed. This arrow here, you remember, I said, here's the point where the mind is freed from attachment. What happens now? When the mind is freed from attachment, you can no longer plot fear and grief on this line. So then the graph has to terminate at this point. This line has to terminate at this point. While the above line can continue, fear and grief can no longer be dotted on this chart. Why? Well, I've just said. Well, I'm talking about a scenario where attachment has been removed from the mind. So when there's no attachment, there's no fear, neither there is any grief. So fear and grief are removed, and all you are left with is the arising and passing away of the mind, and along with that the five aggregates. Does that make sense to everyone? If that still sounds confusing, don't worry. We'll talk about this for as long as you need to. And every time we talk about this, I'll be describing the same phenomenon in a slightly different way. Because the more we talk about this, the more examples we'll come across, the more analogies we'll come across, and someday it's going to click. So don't worry if it doesn't make sense. It's all right. It's perfectly fine. It'll make sense. You just got to give it 100% focus, and you got to give it some time. And you got to get your merits to come and save you. After all, it's your merits that's going to help you understand this. Without merits, you can't understand this, let alone stay awake during the sermon. So you need merits for that. So, what's going on here then? We talked about someone and something. The someone is who has always been present, observing the some things that have always been going on. That is the jati. Avidya paccha jati. Right? ... avidya paccha jati. Ignorance, and then ultimately existence. Over here I'm talking about rebirth. What I'm trying to show you here is when the Buddha referred to rebirth, he's not only talking about your physical birth. He's talking about the rebirth of suffering. He's talking about the rebirth of suffering. Where's the suffering? Well, here's the suffering. It's what we plotted on this line. Grief and fear, grief and fear, grief and fear. So, is rebirth suffering? Yes, suffering is what is being reborn. Does that make sense? Suffering is what is being reborn. But I don't feel suffering, one might ask. Yes, there is no way you can feel suffering because you have never known what it's like to not be suffering. So you have nothing to compare with. Do you remember when we talked about pleasure, we talked about relief from vexation. And when we talked about relief from vexation, do you recall that we always talked about two states? A state where you had a vexation and a state where you had less vexation than the previous state. And then the difference between the two we said was pleasure. Right? So the same concept applies here. You need to be able to experience a difference to be able to say, now I know how much suffering I might have had or I had before I was relieved of this suffering. I'll give you a very simple analogy, another one. Say, for instance, you were born with a large tumor on your back. Okay, so either you were born with it, or for as long as you can remember, you've always had this tumor on your back. So it's a big lump, a big mass, a big lump. Okay, that's on your back, and your doctors have said that this is about. If you were to cut the thing off and weigh it, it's going to be about 3 kilos. So that's quite a big lump. Now, if you always had it on your back, you wouldn't know what it weighs like. You wouldn't be able to tell, I know what that feels like, unless you have it removed, and then you can say, I know what I felt like. Because you can only talk about it retrospectively. If you've always had it, then you never know what it's like not to have it. So you'll only know what it feels like to not have it once it's been taken off. Right? So once the thing's been cut off and you regain consciousness, say they give you anesthetics and you lose your consciousness, and then once you regain consciousness, now you'll feel lighter. You'll feel, oh, I never realized it was so heavy. I never realized that, now you know exactly what 3 kilos feels like. You wouldn't know that until it's been taken out. So, you can know it logically, and because someone can tell you, right? The doctor can use some kind of apparatus and measure the thing and sort of weigh it without your body weight added to it and say, this is about 3 kilos in weight. That you can only know logically, but to experience it, you need to have the thing cut off. Another example I'll give you is atmospheric pressure. Do you know what it feels like to not be under atmospheric pressure? Do you know how much 1 ATM, oh, that's not the cash machine, 1 atmospheric pressure feels like? Do you know what that feels like? You probably know what that feels like, but you never felt what it feels like. The reason for that is because you've not known what it's like to be without atmospheric pressure. So only perhaps an astronaut who leaves the Earth's gravitational force and goes into space where there is no atmosphere and therefore no atmospheric pressure will be able to one day realize. Of course, they'll be able, they'll do all sorts of training in their artificial chambers and such, whatnot. But let's say, for the first time they've gone to space. That's when they'll know, oh, I see what 1 atmospheric pressure feels like. In other words, what atmospheric pressure feels like. They wouldn't know it until they've escaped from the atmosphere. Does that make sense to you? A more relatable example. Say someone had an accident and they had to have one of their limbs cut off. Say they had to have their leg cut off because they've had a bad accident, a terrible accident. Now, this person will have always lived with their leg attached to their body. So they're not going to know how much their leg weighs. Do you know how much your leg weighs? No, I don't mean typing it into Google and finding out how much your leg weighs. Can you feel how much your leg weighs? You would have probably felt how much your arm weighs. Sometimes when you sleep on your arm and your arm goes numb, and then you try to move about and you try to move your arm out of the way and it's not moving and you think you've lost your arm, and then you realize, oh no, you've just been sleeping on it and it's gone numb. What do you do then? When you want to move it, what do? You'll normally lift it with your other arm, your good arm, you lift it, and then you feel the weight of your arm. Next time, you know what, if you really want to experience this, sleep on your arm. Right, to try it out, just as an experiment. Sleep on your arm for an hour or so, and then your arm's going to go numb, and then lift it up and ask yourself the question, did you ever realize that your arm weighed so much? You'll know what I'm talking about then. Did you ever realize that your arm weighed so much? You didn't, because you have not known what it feels like to have your arm attached to yourself. Because you've never had anything to compare it with. You've never had a what does it feel without to compare with what does it feel with. So how can you tell this is how it feels like? Right, so hopefully I think you're on board with what I'm trying to explain to you here. Now that is why, folks, you don't feel that this self is really suffering. Because you've never not had, or you've never not felt I. You've never not felt a self. Going back to your childhood, have you not felt a self? When you were 5 years old, did you not feel yourself? At 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 55, 75, 85, have you not felt self? You always felt the self. So there was never a moment in your life where you didn't feel the self. The I or the someone. You've never had a moment in your life where you've not felt that someone. It's always been there. So that being the case, how do you know what it's like when you don't feel it? What have you got to compare it with? Because you've never known what it's like without it. You've only ever known feeling it. So you can't say that it's a bad thing. You've never had a problem with it because you've never seen that as suffering. So what the Buddha does is, in his teachings, he explains to us that that which you feel as a self is suffering. So I was talking to you about the encounter with the Brahmins and the Buddha, when they asked him, Venerable Sir, we feel a self. So, this is what they refer to as the soul or the Atma. We feel a self. The question we have is, how does this self come into being? Or really, the question that we have is, is it in the Rupa? Because they knew about the Rupa, they knew about the Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara and Vijnana. They probably didn't know it in terms of Anicca, Dukkha and Anatta. But they knew that there was something called Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara and Vijnana. They probably didn't even know that it arises and passes away. How can they feel that something arises and passes away? Because they've always sensed an ever-presence. When they've always felt an ever-presence, without a teaching to show that the arising and passing away happens separately to the suffering which is an ever-present, steady, static phenomenon, without a teaching, without actually showing this and laying it out bare, how can one grasp the concept, the idea that this Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana rise and pass away? They would not have known about that. They would not have been able to make sense of that. So that's why they went to the Buddha and asked, is it in the Rupa? So you see, just think about that for a moment. Do you think those Brahmins thought that Rupa had the characteristic of anicca, which is arising and passing away? There is no reason why they would have thought like that. In fact, they thought the complete opposite, because they felt an ever-present self, and they attributed that ever-present self to Rupa. By that alone, does that not tell us something about the way they thought about Rupa? They thought that Rupa was something that was ever-present. They didn't know that it rose and passed away. They thought that it was an ever-present entity, Rupa. Because they felt an ever-present self, and they attributed that to Rupa. And they thought the same about Vedana. They thought the same about Sanya, Sankara and Vijnana. So the five aggregates, they attributed the ever-present self, the someone, the I, to the Rupa Vedana, Sanya, Sankara and Vijnana. So therefore, clearly, they would have thought that Rupa Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana was not something that arises and passes away. It was something that has always been there. It's always been there. It's always been there, it's always been steady, it's always been static and fixed. So it's no surprise then that they would walk up to the Buddha and ask, where in the Rupa is this self? Because their assumption is that the self or the Rupa is steady, and they're not assuming that the self is steady, because actually that's a personal experience. It's not that they heard that from someone, they felt it. They felt, it's like when you have a stomachache, it's not something that you believe because someone's told you that. You experience it firsthand. You got a stomachache. How can someone say you haven't got a stomachache when you got a stomachache? Because you feel it, so it's there, right? So likewise, they feel an ever steady and present and permanent self. What they wanted to do was attribute that to Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana, because they had learnt about the five aggregates. Not that they arise and pass away, but the fact that they are present. So they're trying to link these two things together. That's why I say, you can't think of those people as being fools. They were highly intellectual people. They try to make sense of the self. Come on, how, isn't that intellectual ability at its best? Because they felt an ever-presence. And what they wanted to do was to attribute that to something that they learnt about, something that they knew and they had learnt existed. That is the five aggregates. So they're trying to link these two things together. So when asked from the Buddha, is it in the Rupa? His answer is, you're asking the wrong question. You can see how that could have been quite confusing to the Brahmins. How can that be the wrong question to be asking? Because if I feel an ever-present self and the Rupa is ever-present, then surely it has to be in the Rupa. Am I in the Rupa? You're asking the wrong question. Okay, so is the Rupa in me? You're asking the wrong question. Okay, so am I made up of Rupa? You're asking the wrong question. Okay, then is Rupa made up of me? You're asking the wrong question. So immediately then they're going to jump to Vedana, because where else would they jump to? Okay, so surely then, am I in the Vedana? Again, you're asking the wrong question. And the same series of questions and answers continue until they go up to Vijnana, and then that's it, they've hit a dead end. So when finally asking the question, so is Vijnana made up of me? You're asking the wrong question. So now they're helpless. They're lost. Because they came in, they sort of came to meet the Buddha with a multiple choice question. They said, we've got 20 possible answers, please pick the right one. And the Buddha goes, none of the above. You're asking the wrong question. That would have been quite a disappointment. They were sold on the fact that it had to be either in the Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankaro Vijnana. They strongly believed in that. So multiple choice, pick which one Buddha. If you can pick the right one, then you've got to be the Buddha. And the other teachers that they'd gone to, pretty much every one of them very happily picked one of the 20 and said, it's this one. No, it's this one. Oh no, it's this one. And then they gave their reasoning for that. But you can see they were not content with those answers. This is why they kept on looking. And thank heavens they did. Until they came to someone who said, you're asking the wrong question. The question's wrong. You're asking me to pick the answer. How can I pick the answer when the question's wrong? Remember one day in one of the sermons I told you, if you get an answer, if you get a question paper at an exam and the question's wrong, then the examiner is going to afford full marks for that particular question. Because you can't give a wrong question and expect the student to pick the right answer. Right? So the question's wrong. Therefore, ask the right question. But this Brahmin doesn't know which question to ask. Because as far as he's concerned, he's asked all the possible and viable questions. I don't know which other question to be asking. So then the Buddha helps him out. He says, ask me, how does this self come into being? So what he's saying is, don't come to me with answers and expect me to pick an answer for you. Come to me with the question and I'll help you find the answer. I think there's something important for us to take away as a lesson from there also. That is, apart from the Dhamma that we need to learn out of it. Sometimes, you might do this yourself, where you walk up to someone and you give them a series of answers and say, which one is it? Is it this or that one? Now you're expecting the person you're answering to pick one of the two, which means you know that there's a 50% chance that it's going to be one or the other. So in other words, you're 50% right. So you're already going to the person, asking the question with the right answer. You just want your help from the other person to pick which one it is. You can't expect every soul on this earth to be as merciful as the Buddha. So chances are, sometimes, the person you're asking the question from will realize that you're asking the wrong question, but you can't expect him to have infinite mercy to be responding to the question with a question, or to respond to your question with the words, you're asking the wrong question. What do I mean by this? Particularly when you walk up to a teacher with a question. I've seen a lot of people do this but especially the Dhamma. Sometimes when we go to sermons and people come and ask questions at the end of the sermon. I think 9 times out of 10, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think I'm exaggerating here, 9 times out of 10, they'll come up to us and say, Swaminathan, I've been thinking about what you said there, right? And this particular thing that you said, is it this or this? So now we are saying, I know the answer. It has to be in one of these 3. I know I'm 30% correct. I just need your help to figure out which one. Now what if neither of those is the right answer because you're asking the wrong question? You'd be lucky if your teacher has mercy on you. If they feel kind and generous towards you, they'll go the extra mile and they'll tell you, you're asking the wrong question. But here's the other thing. That hits your ego. So now you have another problem. Not only do you need the answer to this problem, but you've just been put into a very difficult situation because now your ego has just been attacked. Meaning, none of the above answers you brought to me are correct. That makes you look like a fool. So sometimes, if you are not able to stomach that, your teacher might say, this one. Or he might say, which one do you think it is? And then you go, I think it's this one. Yeah, sounds about right. Just think about the other two also. Or carry on thinking about it. You get to the right answer. You're probably right with that anyway. I think there's a danger there. Because now you're expecting to, you're thinking you've already got the right answer. So let's take a lesson from that. When we go to our teachers with our questions, I think it's always safest to go with an open question rather than going to them with an answer and saying, or three answers and saying, which one of these three is it? Unless, of course, the teacher says, come to me with your answers and I'll help you figure out which one it is. In which case, they probably want you to start thinking for yourself, for a change. But most other times, it's always safest to go and ask an open question, particularly when you're talking to your teachers. So that's just a gentle reminder. I have had many people who have come up to me, particularly at the end of sermons and so forth, and they ask, which one of these three is the right answer? They're already fixed on the fact that one of these is the right answer. But what if they're asking the wrong question? Okay, so the same thing happened back in the day of the Buddha, but in his infinite mercy, he said, none of those is the right answer. You're asking the wrong question. So then he said, what is the right question to be asking, Venerable Gautama? The question you should be asking me is, how does this sense of a self come into being? Ask me that. Okay, so how does it come into being? And then he takes this man on that journey. You remember that journey, right? He talks about bhava, he talks about upadana, he talks about tanha, he talks about vedana, all the way up until abhisankara, and then on to avidya, or ignorance. Now this is the groundbreaking moment. This is the earth-shattering moment, because you've just been told that the question you're asking is a silly question. Or really what you've just been told is, you should not be feeling a self. How so? Well, what is ignorance after all? As I said, for people back in the day, to be told that one is ignorant is the worst insult. It's like saying someone's fat in today's days. You're fat. It's as insulting back then to say that someone's ignorant. Right? So, when told you're ignorant, what the Buddha is alluding to is that you should not be feeling what you're feeling. Do you understand my point there? This man's walked up to the Buddha asking, what is it I'm feeling? Or this self that I'm feeling, not what is it I'm feeling. He's gone asking, this self I'm feeling, where is it? So he's already sold, he's already fixed on the fact that the self is fine, there's nothing wrong with the self. I just want to know, where is it? And the Buddha is saying, you're ignorant. By which what his meaning is, you shouldn't even be feeling what you're feeling, let alone trying to figure out where it is. Do you get that? What he's trying to say is, you shouldn't be feeling what you're feeling, let alone trying to figure out where it is you're feeling it. So then the man asks, I shouldn't be feeling what I'm feeling? Why is that? Because he's come in saying, I feel a self, I feel pleasure, I feel good. Because really what you're feeling is goodness. As you know, I mentioned one day people say, it feels good to be me. Meaning, the feeling of a self. People have never seen that as being a problem. That's joy, that's pleasure. It's good to be me. So then to be told, that alone, that in itself is ignorance. And then the Buddha holds this man's hand, not literally, metaphorically, and takes him through the dependent origination process, descending it now, and going from ignorance to abhisankara, vijnana, namarupa, and so on, until he gets to jati. So that he's come to jati now. Jati is where he started, right? When he started this series of questions, jati is where they started. So jati is this feeling of a self. But then the Buddha continues. Remember, this is a feeling that is founded in ignorance. So therefore, what you're feeling cannot be what you're feeling. That's why in a previous sermon I said, what you feel does not exist. What you feel is not what really exists. What really exists is not what you feel. So this Brahmin is now faced with the same problem. He's come and said, I feel something. And the Buddha just said, what you're feeling is not what exists. How has he said that? What is the Buddha's term for that? Ignorance. Right? So then he says, let me show you then what it is you're feeling. If what you're feeling is not what you think you're feeling, let me show you what you're feeling. And then he continues, jati pacchaya, jara marana, shoka parideva, dukkha domanassa, eva metassa kevalassa, dukkha khandassa samudaya hoti. Dependent on rebirth, you have decay and death, fear, lamentation, all the way until he confirms that what you're feeling is heaps of suffering. So that which this person came and started to ask about, and his symptoms, if you want to put it that way, was, I feel something ever present. What is it? Or where is it? And now the Buddha is showing this person, he's helping this man to realize through the dependent origination process. Remember, this is the dependent origination of suffering. This is why you have ignorance in there. This is why you have attachment in there. You know this. Vedana paccaya tanha, avidya paccaya sankhara. Right? So both ignorance and attachment take a prime place in this on this process. So this is the dependent origination process. Dependent origination of what? Dependent origination of suffering. And you know now that wherever there is suffering, or wherever there is attachment, there is suffering, and suffering is primarily twofold. You've got fear and you've got grief. And I have showed you on the graph there, on the chart here, that it is indeed grief and fear that take turns along this line. So, that which you have felt as an ever-presence is fear and grief all along. This is suffering all along. Again, I hear you say, but I don't feel fear, I don't feel grief, Swaminathan. I feel it feels good to be me. Of course, you won't feel this as suffering until you are free from it. That is like the weight that you carried on your body, on your back. Remember the lump, the tumor you carried on your back? You only knew how much it weighed after you got rid of it. Not until then. That is like the pressure of the atmosphere. You only know how that feels after you are free from it. So then, and the reason for that is because you got nothing to compare it with. Now, of course, you know what a headache feels like. Tell me why that is. Why do you know? Not how do you know. Why do you know what a headache feels like? There's a very simple reason for that. There are times in your life where you do not have the headache. Yes or no? So therefore, when you get a headache, you go, my head's starting to hurt. I've now got a headache. What you're saying is there was a time in my life where I did not have this pain, and now I've got it. Isn't that why you feel this delta? There's a change. This difference is what you're sensing. But if you were born with a headache and you've always had it, you wouldn't know any different. That's how you always known it. You always known a headache. So much so that you wouldn't know that you got a headache. So it's like that. So say one fine day someone gives you some medicines, and when you take that medicine your headache is cured. A headache that you always had throughout your lifetime is cured. How would you feel then? One of the best places you can observe this phenomenon is, I have seen, I remember watching some videos, I think on YouTube, a long time ago. You can probably still find them on there, where people are given eyesight for the first time. So they were born with some kind of visual defect. So they were not able to see the world clearly. And then one fine day, either through surgery or some optical lenses or something, they get to see the world. There are cases where people start to see color for the first time. Surgery or some kind of medical intervention, and they're able to see color for the first time. They're able to see sights for the first time. They're able to hear for the first time. You gotta, I would even encourage you to go and watch maybe a video of this. Just type it onto YouTube and you'll find some stuff. Not now, after the sermon. Otherwise, that's a distractor. I know you want to go and do it now, but don't do it now. Fight the urge. Just look at the expression on their faces. Usually they become so emotional. They'll start to weep. They can't bear the joy. They're overjoyed. It's so overwhelming. Some of them will start jumping on their feet. Now, it's the same phenomenon here. They've always been blind, either completely or colorblind, and then one fine day they get given their eyesight. Their eyesight is restored. Or they've always been deaf, and one fine day their sense of hearing is restored. So something that they've always had, they only know what they've been missing when it's restored. If they've always missed, if they've never known what it's like to not have it, or what it's like to have it, if they've never known what it's like to have it, how would they know what it's like not to have it? Because you've got nothing to compare it with. The same story applies here. The reason that you don't feel that this self, the you, the I, right, this sense of an ever presence, the reason you don't feel that as suffering is because you've never been without it. Is there ever going to be a day where you will know what it's like? Of course there will be. What's that day? The day when the causes which bring rise to that fear and grief have been removed from your mind. What is the cause again? That is attachment. So once attachment has been removed from your mind, once the mind is free from attachment, now there is nothing that can create fear and grief. Right? Because fear and grief are products. They're also conditional things. So in other words, you need conditions to bring them about. And the condition being attachment, the dependency being attachment. So once attachment is removed, fear and grief can no longer exist. So once attachment has been removed, fear and grief are gone. This is what I've shown here, in this part of the graph. Where this arrow is pointing at, that's where attachment has been removed from the mind, and along with that, fear and grief. What change, what impact does that have on the mind itself? Well, the mind will no longer sense fear and grief, which means the mind is now free. The sense of joy that you will experience at that point is not something that I can explain to you in words. I have not experienced this as yet, but I can see what it might be like. And I can see it's coming. One day. Soon, hopefully. A day where the mind is no longer suffering from fear and grief. Because it's only attachment that creates it. So once attachment is gone, how can fear and grief exist? Tanha vipamuttasya nati soko kuto bhayam. Seeing will continue, smelling will continue, hearing can continue, tasting can continue, sense of touch can continue, thinking thoughts, that all of that can continue. So all 6 of those sense doors, they can continue bringing in information. So you can still live, you can still receive guests. What do I mean by this? Of course, you know I'm talking metaphorically here. You can still be informed that you have guests. You can still identify your guests. You can still decide what you're going to do with your guests. And you can still perceive your guests. So all of that can happen without any problem. What cannot happen? You can't suffer anymore. You can't suffer anymore because the cause of suffering, being attachment, has been removed. How has that attachment been removed? Attachment only exists for as long as ignorance exists. What is ignorance then, after all? Ignorance is, in its very simplest terms, the notion, the misguided view, the misinterpretation, as we discussed earlier, that this suffering is pleasurable. Or this suffering in itself is pleasure. That this suffering is problem-free. There is nothing wrong with this suffering. You wouldn't say that there's nothing wrong with suffering unless you've seen it. Because then it's not suffering. So you won't talk about suffering in those terms. All you would sense is an ever steadiness. All you would sense is a presence. All you would sense is a self. You wouldn't sense it. You wouldn't sense an arising and passing away. You wouldn't sense. You wouldn't know that you're sensing fear and grief. That is what wrong view is. Miccha ditti. So samma ditti, right view, is to know and understand and realize that that which you are sensing is fear and grief, and hence suffering. So what must we do for that? How do we get to a point in our life whereby we can be free of this so-called suffering? You probably put suffering within inverted commas there. You're saying it's suffering. Yes, possibly. You're still taking my word for it. And because you can't feel that it's suffering until you start to work on it. As you go through the noble eightfold path, and as you work your way through the noble attainments, it's quite possible that you start to chisel away at this this suffering. Right? So it's going to start to diminish in size and intensity. That is quite possible. It's not like it's going to be there one day and it's not going to be there the other day. It's going to diminish in size. It's going to diminish in intensity. But you're not going to get rid of it until one day where attachment is completely eradicated. So what must we do then to experience this bliss where the mind is free of suffering? Well, first things first, you got to understand this. Without you understanding this, there is no way that you can do anything about it. It starts with sammaditthi. It starts with the first noble truth. The first noble truth that this which you feel, this that which comes into being, this that which is being reborn is suffering. Why? So I tried to make a reference to rebirth, and I explained to you we can prove rebirth here. So do you see with each chitta what is being reborn? And you know that rebirth is a result of karma. It's not a vipaka. Right? So what happens here due to karma? What happens here due to vipaka? So what happens here due to vipaka is the arising and passing away of the chitta, and along with that the five aggregates. That is vipaka. How do we know? Where else does it happen? In the mind of an arahant. So therefore, an arahant is pure vipaka. 100% vipaka. That's an arahant. This fear and grief, that is the product of attachment. An attachment comes in the dependent origination process, where abhisankara features right at the top of it. Avidya pacha sankara, and of course sankara there we know is abhisankara. So abhisankara pacha vijnana nama rupa salayatana phassa vedana tanha. See, so abhisankara is what is the foundation of attachment. So abhisankara is also karma. That's why we talked about punya abhisankara, apunya abhisankara. This is the karma, this is volition, intention. Right? So intention is the foundation, volition is the foundation for attachment. And the bringing about of this steady flow of grief and fear, and interpreting it as a self. So it's not just abhisankara on its own, but vijnana and nama rupa, and it's a whole process. So you can't say it's it's this that's doing that. It's the process, the entire process. So each part of that process is essential to bringing about rebirth. Rebirth, again, you must understand here, is with each chitta. And as I said, I'm keeping this really simple here rather than going into every little fragment within this chitta. But at every point here is actually rebirth. Rebirth happens at every point on this line. Every dot on this line is a point of rebirth. But to keep it simple, if you were to take each chitta on its own and take it in isolation, that's still rebirth. Every chitta is being reborn. What is you that's being reborn here? It's the you who you are not who you think you are. That is the suffering that is being reborn here. Is it not this that you feel as an ever-present I? So who's reborn then? I am reborn. What's I after all? Suffering. So what is reborn then? If A equals B and B equals C, what does A also equal? Right, same concept applies here. Who's reborn? I am reborn. What is I? Suffering. So what is rebirth then? The rebirth of suffering. Now, do you need to die physically for that to happen? Or does that not happen in every chitta? Does that not happen in every chitta? In its simplest form? But if you remember these lines that I've drawn vertically from the chitta down to this graph here, each of those moments was a moment of fear and grief, remember? So you have rebirth all across this line. This is the rebirth line. Rebirth of what? Rebirth of suffering. Because it's the birth of suffering and the rebirth of suffering. So we have proved rebirth. So you can't say that rebirth does not exist. Because we have proved it. You must not take that rebirth simply talks about or talks only about life after the death of the physical body. Because the Buddha talks very little about that. The reason for that is you don't need the Buddha to tell you that. Those Brahmins, when they came to meet the Buddha, one of the reasons they came and asked and talked to him about it is because they sensed a self was ever present, not only in that lifetime but also from previous births. So they knew already that rebirth existed. When the Bodhisattva was students of Alara and Uddaka, his teachers, before he went to the 5 ascetics, he practiced and he gained the ability to look at his past lives. The Purva Nivasanusati Jnana was one that the Bodhisattva gained before he attained enlightenment, before he became the awakened one. So he's the awakened one not because he could see his previous lives. That he was able to see, not just in that last birth as a Bodhisattva. He had perfected that art. Well, I wouldn't say perfected, but he was able to look back into his previous lives, many lives before. And a lot of the stories about pretas, right? If you ever done any reading into the Vimanavattu or the Pretavattu, which are texts in the Buddhist scriptures, when usually they have conversations, those beings who are born in the woeful planes, they are in conversation with the elders. And when asked, what karma did you do to bring you into this birth? They talk about what happened to them in their previous life. They're not Buddhas. Far from it. They're in the woeful plane. But they're still able to look back into their previous lives and relate the stories, relate the events that led them to be born in such woeful planes. So the ability to look into previous lives is not what makes one the awakened one. So therefore, to take that rebirth is simply talking about birth prior to this physically. You don't need the Buddha to come and tell you that. People knew that way before the Buddha came into this world. So then clearly, my point there being, when the Buddha talks about rebirth, he couldn't only have been talking about that. He must have referred to something else also. He must have talked about a rebirth that only Aryans can see. Only the Buddhas and his disciples can understand. Only those who have received the Buddha's teaching can understand and comprehend. I'm trying to show you this is what he would have talked about. The rebirth of suffering. It is suffering that you feel as a self, as a presence, as the I am. This is the Sam. This is the who's on the chair. This is the who. In reality, there was never a who. A who never existed. What existed? Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana existed because they arose and passed away. The Chitta which carried those aggregates existed, which they arose and passed away. Due to attachment, suffering existed. That's all that existed. You didn't exist. I don't exist. Self doesn't exist. Me doesn't exist. Vipakas bring about Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana. Karma brings about suffering. But it's based on the vipaka that karma can happen, because you see, to attach you need to have something to attach to, right? So if there weren't Rupa and Vedana, Sanya, Sankara and Vijnana, what can you attach to? And without attachment there's not going to be fear or grief. So you need vipaka to bring about karma. That's why vipako karma sambhavo. So when there's vipaka, and then there'll be sangbhava. In the presence of ignorance and attachment, karmas happen, and then rebirth comes into existence. Vipako kamma sambhavo. Kamma vipaka vattanti. So kamma vipaka vattanti. So karmas in return bring about the vipakas. When a karma is done, there's always an energy that brings about a vipaka. You can also interpret it as being karmas take the path of the vipakas. So it follows the path of the vipaka. Kamma vipaka vattanti. Where vata can be considered the path. So the karma takes the path of the vipaka, as you can see here. So you can see the karma, which is the abhisankara, follows the path of the vipaka. But along its path, what it creates is suffering. Tasma punabbhavo hoti. See, now punabbhava, punarbhava or rebirth comes into being. Evam loko pavattati. Now here loko really refers to suffering. That's why in his own words the Buddha says, dukkho loke patittita. This loka, or I think the word world does not really make sense in this context. The better word for it is suffering, loka, in this context. This loka is based in suffering. So what he's saying is, when he talks about loka, he's really talking about suffering. To be saying that one is based on the other, it's pretty much to be saying that they're both one and the same. So, tasma punabbhavo hoti evan loko pavattati. This is how suffering comes into being. No, we can see that now. This is how punarbhava comes into being. Punarbhava being rebirth. Rebirth of what? Rebirth of suffering. But karmas can only be done onto vipakas. So for a karma to happen, you need a vipaka as a foundation. You understand that clearly, right? So you can't attach to a vipaka. And as a result of that, you get suffering. Is there anything wrong with vipaka? No. You got to understand that it is nothing wrong. Suffering is not the fault of vipaka. Suffering is caused by attachment. The fault there is attachment, not the vipaka. It's like fire doesn't burn you unless you touch it. Unless you come to contact with it, fire doesn't burn you. So, if you got burned, whose fault is that? Is that the fault of fire? How can you say it's the fault of fire? Because doesn't fire help you with lots of things in life? Isn't that why you can cook and do various other things? So, fire is not to blame. Misuse of it is to blame. Don't touch what you should not touch. So, vipakas are not to be touched. They should just be let free, untouched. Left untouched, vipakas don't bring suffering. The moment you touch it, the moment you grasp, the moment you cling, the moment you attach, fear and grief enter the picture. Suffering comes into being, and because suffering doesn't arise and pass away, unlike the vipaka, now you have something steady, a steady flow of something, and that something really is what we call the someone. So you can understand I am referring to something because there's no other word I can use to refer to it. Something comes into being, really what I'm talking about here is the someone, this someone. The fear and grief. This is the self, this is the me, this is the I am. This is the ever-presence. Because in the vipakas, there is no possibility, there is no technical ability. Technically, it is impossible for an ever-presence to be felt through the vipakas, because there's always an arising and passing away. So it's not possible to be feeling an ever-presence. Okay? So I'm going to leave you to dwell on that for another week, for some time. As I said, I'm not going to move forward from this point until we have discussed this a few times at least, and until it starts to make sense. Rather than jotting questions on the chat, it's preferable if you can send them through in forms of email. If you have any questions, the email address I think is in the description, so you can use that to send us your questions if you have any. But even if sometimes you may not be able to phrase your question. Something remains unanswered but not sure how to phrase it. Don't worry. Don't worry about not being able to ask your question. You don't know what the right words are to ask your question, or you still can't understand this. It's fine. Like I said, we'll talk on this topic for as long as it's required. And of course, from time to time we'll switch topics and we talk about. I mix and balance the two things, right? We talk about the Dhamma, and then I share with you some ideas, some advice. Every once in a while I tell you off, right? I know that's why you keep coming to the sermons, because you want me to. That's the bit you enjoy the most, right? But don't worry. If you don't understand this, it's perfectly fine. All I want from you is your commitment. I don't want you to understand this. I want your commitment. Understanding will happen. Let understanding happen. Let me worry about that. I'll look after that bit. But I want your commitment. This is why I said, look at your weekends. If you, when you're listening to the sermon, is the time you start nodding off and you become drowsy, right? Then perhaps you need to make a change in your schedules. Perhaps Saturday long nights is not going to work for you. Maybe going to the gym on a Sunday morning and then come in and listen to the sermon after a heavy meal. Perhaps is not what works for you. But we can watch the recording. Yes, that you can do. You can watch. You go back and watch it later. You can do that. But it's always better to join the live sermon whenever it's possible. However, give it your full commitment. Try your best to give your commitment to this, and then understanding will happen. That's a very natural thing. I listen to the Dhamma, I practice the Dhamma, I follow the advice given to me by my teachers, and these are the secrets to my success. They're not secrets after all. It's what everybody knows, but what nobody likes to do. That's the secret to my success. Both in my lay life and in my life as a clergy, as a monk, the secret to my success has been, I do the things that other people don't like to do. I do the things that other people like to talk about. They'll talk about it, but they won't do it. And then they'll look at me and go, Swaminathan, how come you understand this so beautifully? It's because I do what you don't do, that's why. Is usually the answer they get back from me. So, are you someone who likes to talk like me? Or are you someone who likes to understand what I can understand? If you are someone who likes to talk like me, all you got to do is listen to this sermon a few times, right? And then you can practice talking like me, and then you can start preaching. If you want to understand the Dhamma and to help you free yourself from suffering, still you got to listen to this a few times. So there's no change there. And then what you got to do is give it your full attention and your focus, and do the other things that we have asked you to do. Like being kind to other people, like helping others in the difficult times, being generous, being a blessed one, being a blessing on others, being a blessing upon yourself, being a blessing to other people's lives. You got to do those things. Always being kind, being very patient with others. When other people shout at you, say bad things about you, foul-mouth you, backstab you, try to do things to hurt you, both mentally and physically, become a shock absorber. Absorb the shock and let them and relieve them of their symptoms. Because when you become a pain reliever, your pain shall be relieved. Ever heard a paracetamol pill complaining about a headache? No, because its job, its purpose is to relieve others from pain. So likewise, when you relieve others of pain, your pain shall be relieved. That's the way it always worked. It's the way it works. It's the way it will work. Don't try to beat the system. Because you're lazy, don't try to beat the system. Don't try to find shortcuts. Don't try to find the easy way out of this. There is no easy way out of this. This is the way. The Buddha didn't talk about the Noble Eightfold Path and the Noble Fourfold Path. He only talked about one Eightfold Path. There's 8 steps in that. You can't find one with less than 8. It doesn't work like that. So don't try to find shortcuts. If you're not achieving results, the problem is not with the Dhamma. The problem is with you. Okay? So that's just a bit of general and friendly advice, gentle advice. So I urge you to take that on board. Let the Dhamma sink into your minds. That'll happen naturally. It's the other stuff, the difficult stuff, the stuff that people don't like to do, the stuff that people like to talk about, and advice, that's the stuff you got to do. This stuff will just happen. Okay? So, I'll leave you with that for this week. But last week I promised you to bring you or bring to life the lives of the great elders. Excuse me. So I want to continue to do that start from this week and continue to do that for as long as we can do it. Excuse me. And we have prepared for that. We have prepared that for you for today. So now, Venerable Dasathero will be talking to you about his role model. He says it's his role model who is going to be. I asked him who's your role model one day, and this is the answer I got back from him. So he's going to be talking to you about his role model today. It's not Superman or Spider-Man or Batman, but it's a great man. So I want you to pay full attention to that also. And the thing is, while what you listen to on that sermon or in his sermon is not going to be as heavy as what I've talked to you about this morning, to become like him, that's not going to be easy. Although when you listen to that sermon, when you listen to Dasahandru talk, you will think, all that is easy stuff. Why should I bother? Right? That's not the easy stuff. That's the difficult stuff. So really, he's going to talk about the difficult stuff. I'm the simple one, so I talk about simple stuff. He's a tough guy, so he's going to talk about the difficult stuff. Okay, so without further ado then, I'm going to pass you over to Venerable Dasathero. He'll talk to you about his role model, and he has promised that he will continue to talk about various other figures in this noble lineage in future sermons also. We'll see, we'll do it for as long as we have the means to do it, and for as long as both technically and practically it's possible. But while it's a possibility, I want you all to take the maximum you can from it. Take down notes if you need to. Listen to the story. Listen to how you can relate your life to the great life of that great elder, and see what lessons you can take from him. And if I were to give you a challenge, see if you can take one quality from his life and instill that in your life. If you start to do that with each story that is related to you, henceforth, you'll be amazed at the product that shall remain a few months or maybe a few years from now. Remember, what I have talked to you about, this is the easy stuff. You may think this is the tough stuff. This is not the difficult stuff. This is the easy stuff. To become someone like who Dasahandru is going to be talking to you about, that's the difficult stuff. After all, what I've talked to you about today is simply a means to get to that end. That is not a means to get to this end. This is a means to get to that end. So hopefully you're all on board with that. Okay? So I'll hand you over to our Venerable Dasathero, he'll talk to you, and he'll conclude the sermon with the transfer of merits. So, as a final remark, go back and listen to this sermon again, and also the previous one if you haven't done as yet. I will continue to talk about this in future sermons also. So one final time I'm going to be saying this: if you didn't understand this, it's okay. Whatever bit you understood, if you only understood 1% of this, fantastic. Don't worry about the other 99%. That will come with time. Trust me, that will come with time. If you consider me as a teacher, you got to trust your teacher. Otherwise, you got to go find another teacher. Trust me, that will come with time. Okay, so don't worry about it. But try and listen to what Dasahandru has to tell you, and see if you can become like him. Not like Dasahandru, although that's not too bad either, but like his role model. That would be even better, I think. Okay? So may the Noble Triple Gem be with you all.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay. Right, today I have the honors of the honor of talking to you about an arhat that I say is an inspiration or a role model to me, and hopefully by the end of this small sermon or discussion would be also an inspiration to you as well. Let's hope I can do justice to his qualities as well. So today I'd like to talk about an arhat who I feel is one that is extremely powerful, but yet he doesn't use his power. It's funny because, as we all know, throughout history, power usually is something that, when given to humans, is something that destroys them or is used to their advantage, and it ruins their lives and lives of others. But this arhat, this great person, this great arhat, has the power but doesn't use it for his benefit. So some of you may have guessed already. Today I'm going to talk to you about the story of Mahamoggallana. As I retell the story, I'd like you all to imagine you are in his shoes, or you are in his life. Experience what he would be feeling in that moment, because as you may see that he has done many things that you and I, you'll see. Okay. So a long time ago, right, in a town called Kolita near the city of Rajagaha, in the clan called Moggallana, which is a well-known, respected, admired clan at the time, a baby was born. Now, this baby, his parents called him Kolita, named him after the town that they were in. Now this baby's father, he was a very well-respected person, and he was prominent. They lived in a prominent family, where usually the town major was selected from. They were in a high caste, and therefore this father was a petty king. So this child, or Kolita, baby Kolita, lived with wealth and honor, and he didn't see much suffering, or he didn't see much sorrow in his life. On that same day, as fate, Upadisa, or his to-be best friend, was born on the same day. Now, Upadisa and Kolita were basically best friends. They were inseparable. If you ask people who know them, they'll say that if you see Kolita, you are bound to see Upadisa nearby. If you see Upadisa, you're bound to see Kolita nearby. They were inseparable. They used to do everything together, whether it's learning, whether it's playing. They do everything together. Soon as they grow up, they get to see each other's qualities. Kolita can see that Upadisa was more adventurous, was more daring, was a much braver person. But Kolita was more of a person that preserves, or cultivates, or enrich things that he has. But even though they had very different qualities, they hardly fought with each other. They hardly had an argument, or ever had anything, or had ever had any disagreements. But you see, in their family, Kolita was the only child. So, as you can guess, he had a lot of hopes behind him. But whereas Upadisa, he had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. Now, as time goes on, this friendship strengthens. It strengthens to the point where the opposite sex, or females, didn't have much interest in them. But they may not be interested in women, but they are still drunken with youth. They're still drunken with health and life itself. And Kolita and Upadisa were the leaders of their group of friends. It is said that when they go to play in the river that's nearby, the friends of Kolita would go on horseback, whereas the friends of Upadisa would go in palanquins. Now they lived their life like this for many, many years. And soon they grew to the age where they were able to go to a special festival. A festival that takes place every year in Rajagaha. It's a public celebration which was called the Hilltop Festival. There are many popular shows and many events, dramas, so on and so forth. And Upadisa and Kolita were looking forward to go to this festival because they've heard a lot about it. And so they were keen anticipation. They even reserved seats to get the best seats to these shows, these dramas, and so on and so forth. So they couldn't wait until they went on the first day. So when the first day arrived, they were full of excitement. Like the shows, at that time were amazing in their eyes. They laughed, they got excited, and so on and so forth. And therefore, obviously, they reserved seats for day 2 as well. But on day 2, they weren't as satisfied. Day 2 left them feeling discontent. They weren't fulfilled. But yet, they reserved seats for day 3. But on the night of day 2, Kolita couldn't fall asleep. He kept tossing and turning in his bed. His thoughts didn't let him fall asleep. Because in his mind, the question, what is the use of all this? What is the use of going to this festival, kept going through his mind. Is there anything worth seeing? What are the benefits of life of enjoyment, or life of pleasure seeking? After a few years, even the actors will become old and feeble. Well, in the future, they will also die. And they will also be reborn. Wait a moment. Which also means we will also die. And I will also be reborn. Well, the actors can't help themselves. They can't stop it themselves. Then how are they supposed to help us? Well, instead of wasting our time in these festivals, we should find a path to stop it. But on that same night, Upadisa also had a strange thought. He had thoughts similar to the one that Kolita had, but he also had a thought that the show shows truth of rebirth, but yet the jokes suppress the truth and the truth and the seriousness of rebirth. But it's almost like we're in an illusion. So the next day, on day number 3 in this festival, they both went to their reserved seats. But as we all know, whenever we see our best friend, we know our best friend so well, we know when they feel sad or when they feel discomfort. So the moment Upadisa came and sat in his seat, Kolita asked him, "My good friend, you don't seem happy today. Is there something bothering you? Come on, tell me." And Upadisa tells Kolita, "Yesterday I couldn't go to sleep. I had these thoughts coming through my mind. Like, what is the use of all this pleasure from the eyes and ears? They are absolutely worthless. We are living in a life of an illusion. It lures us and yet leaves us with nothing. Leaves us empty. Wait, friend. You also don't seem like you're happy. You don't seem like the person you were yesterday. What's going through your mind?" "My good friend Upadisa, the same thoughts have gone through my mind as well. You know what? We should leave. We should leave here and seek the answers to our questions." Now, Upadisa said that we both have had a great thought. A great thought has come to us. We should not waste our time anymore. If we really want to seek the truth, we shall give up our possessions. We should leave home and go forth as a homeless wanderer. And we would be birds. We would be like birds soaring above worldly and sensual bonds. So both of them deciding to leave, they went to their friends. They went to their friends and explained to them what they understood. Now each of these friends were deeply impressed of what depth that they've been thinking, and some of them decided to join them as well. So each of them said farewell to their friends and families, but remember, Kolita was an only child. He was the only child and he was the only male in his family. And as you may know, most families would like their clan to carry on. They would like to bring their family, carry on their family tree. So just imagine the fight that Kolita had to go through. He was in a high caste, in a Brahman caste, and he was the only child. And his father was almost like a petty king of the town Kolita. He was like almost like the major, the prime minister of the place. Now he had to put up a fight, but finally, after putting up a pretty hard fight, his parents allowed him. So over this Kolita and all these friends decided, you know what? They said farewell to their friends and families. They took off their sacred Brahman thread. So a thread that makes them, represents them as a Brahman. Now back in those times, people used to grow their hairs and beards because only the rich can afford to wash them. Only the rich could afford to keep them smelling good and keeping them healthy. So they used to grow their hair, and think about the amount of attachment that they used to have to their hair and beards. Like if I asked you to cut all your hair, how many of you would instantly say yes? But each of these people, they decided to cut their hairs and beards, put on pale saffron garments. So people from a high class, you used to wear probably like very rich clothes with rich colors, and now they decide, you know what, we're gonna put on pale saffron garments. The things that wanderers used to wear. And they finally discard any distinguished marks and anything that shows their privileges and of their class, of their caste. So they finally decide this is the way that they want to go. And so now they've entered the classless, the society of asceticism. Now at the same time, Prince Siddhartha got married. His to-be chief disciples have left home and embarked on a very different quest. Now this different quest was extremely hard because they had to find a spiritual teacher who can answer and give them the path to answer the questions and find a path to a path that will fulfill these two friends. It was a tiresome journey. They were wandering. They were wanderers. They went from place to place looking for a teacher. And there are many teachers. Back in India, back in those times, there are many teachers. Many teachers teaching different teachings. But as their merits held them, each time they went to a teacher, they felt it was hollow, and they found the teaching hollow. There was no use of teacher called Sanjay. And they decided that he spoke a little truth. And after a long search, they haven't found a single teacher that satisfied them. So they decided, you know what, let's go learn under him. After a short time, these two friends have have found out that this teaching haven't answered their question yet. That burning question that keeps driving them. They wake up to this question. They will stop at nothing until this question is answered. So after a short time, they found out that their question isn't answered yet. So Korat and Updesa went to their teacher and asked, "Teacher, what you have taught us, we have understood. We understand everything you've taught us. Is there more to be learned?" And the teacher Sanjay replies, "No, you both have learned my entire teaching. There's nothing more to learn." Now, this surprised the two students, that they've learned the teachings and yet they haven't answered their question, their burning question. And so they decide they're going to leave and continue their search. They can continue some other place. So they worship their teacher and decide to and tell him that they're going to leave to find a new teacher. After all, they didn't leave their family and friends for an endless, futile argument. But they left their family, they left all their loved ones, they left their possessions, they left their high caste, they left their reputation, not just for an endless, futile argument that the teacher Sanjay taught. They want to find the truth about rebirth. They want to end rebirth. They want to find the path to end rebirth. They want to end this suffering that they experience as well. So, they are on their second time in search of a teacher. So they travel throughout the country, from north to south, from east to west, through the dust of the roads, through the heat, scorching sun, through the rain, through the wind. But each time they are driven by the need to find the truth. Nothing can stop them. No, not the elements. Who knows? They may have gone hungry for days. But each time, this burning question or the desire to find the truth drove them on. On that journey, they probably met many ascetics, many Brahmas who have different views and different teachings, but every time these two friends asked them questions and using the teaching that they learned before from the teacher Sanjay, they asked questions and understood that the teaching was empty. None of them had answered their questions. But yet, when these ascetics asked them questions, they could answer them. So, as time goes on, at the age of 40, they decide to go home to Maganda. So from a young adult to the age of 40, they've been on a search for the truth. So let's say that they went to this festival, say at the age of 20. So they were searching for 20 years. Each day, they probably found a new teacher. Learned a bit from him, but found out it's hollow and went to the next. After 20 years, they decide they're going to stop. But they still didn't decide that they're going to completely stop. They made a vow. They made a unbreakable. They made a pact that if one of them finds this path, finds this path to deathlessness, if they find the truth, they would immediately go to their friend and tell them what they've learnt. Now with their vow, they both left their ways and decide if they go separately, they are more likely to spread more ground and find the truth. So shortly before this moment, the Buddha had enlightened. This ascetic Gautama had enlightened to become the Buddha. And after the first and he's also preached the first sermon. And also after his first rain retreat, as I remember, he set 60 disciples, so 60 arhats, to spread the Dharma, and for the well-being and happiness of the world. And the Buddha himself went to Rajagaha and went to the king, who soon became his follower, and gave him the Bamboo Grove Monastery. Now, these two friends were still searching. But one day, Koyata could see in the distance Upatissa, his friend Upatissa, walking towards him. There was something different. He could sense that there was something different in him. Whether it was a smile or whether it felt like he was bubbling with happiness. There was something different. So immediately, as Upatissa came near, Koyata asked, "Friend, you seem different. You seem extremely happy. Tell me, have you found the path to deathlessness?" And Upatissa again says, "Yes, dear friend, I have found it." And he explains the story that he found a monk who said he didn't know much, but yet his appearance was very serene and delightful. And he recited a phrase. And you may not know. He recited a Pali phrase. So, yo Dhamma hetu pava, tesan hetu tatagato aha, tesan chayo nirodo, eon vadi mahasamano. Which I found the translation of those things that arise from cause. The Tathagata has preached the causes, and also has preached the cessation. This is doctrine of the great recluse. The moment Upatissa heard this from this monk, he became a Srimendra or Sotapanna. And as he recited it back to Koyata also became a Srimendra. At once Koyata decided, you know what, Upatissa, let's go to this Buddha. Let's go to this Buddha right now. I would like to meet him. But Upatissa had a different idea. Upatissa decided, you know what, let's go to our teacher, remember teacher Sanjay? Let's go to him and let's show him or tell him that what we've learned. And hopefully he'll come with us as well. So both of them went to the previous teacher and said to him, "We have found what we've been looking for. We have found the truth. But the teacher Sanjaya, he declined the offer. But he also said, Upatissa Koyata, you know what? You've learned so much from me. I will give you, leadership of my students. And you can lead them and you can lead others and you can be famous. And you'll be greatly respected and you'll be respected and everyone will respect you like they respect me. But Upatissa and Koyata there had a smile on their face and said, "Teacher, we don't mind being students for life. Now you have to decide whether you're going to come with us or not, because our decision is final." Now this teacher surprised that his two best students don't want leadership of the others. But yet he was also disrupted as well, because he was in indecision. He wants to go, but yet he doesn't. So as he couldn't control his this feeling of he couldn't decide, he lamented, I can't go, as for many years I've been a teacher, and my students have learnt a lot from me. If I become a pupil again, it will be like a mighty lake turning into a small puddle. But yet he was torn between the truth and to preserve his supreme status or his ego. He couldn't decide whether he wanted the truth or whether he wanted to keep his ego. But he obviously decided the latter and said, my great students, I'm going to stay. You both go. So at the time, Sanjaya had around 500 disciples. And these two, the Upadesa and Kodata, went to these 500 and told them what they've learned. Said they found the truth. They found what they've been looking for. And all of them wanted to go. All of them decided that they want to go. But they found out their teacher isn't leaving. So half of them stayed while the other half left. Now, as the 250 leave, the teacher couldn't hold this grief, this despair, because he couldn't leave, because he said he proclaimed that he was a teacher of many students, and he couldn't, he was a mighty lake and he couldn't be a puddle. But at that moment, it is said that hot blood spurted from his mouth. Basically, he vomited blood because he couldn't handle his despair, his grief. So the two great friends and the other 250 other disciples went to the Mango Grove Monastery. Now, the Buddha saw this group coming close, approaching, and he told his monks, do you see those two people coming in the front? Yes, those two friends. They will be my chief disciples. Now, as the two friends and the 250 others came to the Buddha, they immediately asked for ordination. They asked if they could be ordained under the Buddha. So Upadesa, as he was the son of his mother called Sari, he became Sariputta. And Kodata was named Moggallana the Great because he wanted to be he had to have a name that's different to other major clans, so he was named Mahamoggallana. After the ordination of these 250 and the two friends, the Buddha preached the Dharma. Each of them became Sotapanna, and each of them went on their path and became an Arhat by the end of the sermon. Everyone except Sariputta and Moggallana. Now Sariputta, he decided that he's going to leave and go to this cave in Bull's Den, as I remember. He went to the city for alms, and because he went to this cave, he was able to listen to the Buddha's discourses. And within 14 days, and at the end of 14 days, so 2 weeks, he became an Arhat. Whereas Mahamoggallana went to the forest in Kapilavastu. In a forest in Kalavelaputta, I think. And so he started meditating there. But he was also human, don't forget. We are talking about humans who, like you and I, have problems as well, have defilements as well. See, Mahamoggallana had a problem, as every time he meditates, his head keeps drooping. He keeps falling asleep. Because, think about it, for 40 years he's been wandering. He's been walking from city to city, place to place, looking for a teacher. And he's at the age of 40 after a lot of work. And his body is also very tired. So, he felt sleepy. But he didn't want to go sleep. He wanted to go on this path and he wanted to finish it. But yet, when he meditates, he kept falling asleep. Now, the Buddha, through his divine eye, could see this. He could see that one of his disciples are falling asleep. So, with his supernatural powers, he sent a light to Mahamoggallana and told him, or gave him a discourse on what to do if you feel sleepy. He said, I can't remember everything he said, but he said things like, change your thoughts, maybe change your karmasthana, maybe repeat the discourse in your mind, or like pulling your earlobes, or getting up, washing your face, etc., etc. And after that, the Mahamoggallana started to do this. And the Buddha kept on giving him discourse. Now, he went under meditation under the guidance of the Buddha. It was only because he meditated under the guidance of the Buddha, he became an Arahat. And also supported by his master, Mahamoggallana had gone into states of jhana, or states of samadhi as well, and in the end he was able, he had supernatural powers. Mahamoggallana, after striving hard, after falling asleep and so on and so forth, he became an Arahat within a week. Even after these two friends became an Arahat, they were still inseparable. They still were together, but they didn't have any attachment, but yet they were still together. After they became an Arahat, the Buddha made Sariputta Thero and Moggallana Thero to be his chief disciples. And as you can guess, right, they were newly ordained. After a week and after 2 weeks, they both became an Arahat. And so most other monks and other people were pretty jealous that he made them chief disciples. But the Buddha says they've been fulfilling the requirements for eons. They're fulfilling the paramitas for eons. And so that's why they became the chief disciples. Soon they became the role models of many people. Many people were ordained under having them as role models. They wanted to become like Sariputta and Moggallana. Mothers used to tell their children, if you want to stay as a householder or in a lay life, be like Chitta the householder. But if you want to go forth, be like Sariputta, the great Arahat Sariputta, or the great Arahat Mahamoggallana. It was said that Sariputta was like a mother who gave birth. So giving birth means making his students Sotapanna, whereas Mahamoggallana nursed them to become an Arahat. So like nursing children to become like teachers, helping them become good and great people, Mahamoggallana was like that and have them become an arhat. Even Prince Siddhartha's child, or as we all know him, Rahula, had Sariputta as his teacher, and Mahamoggallana as he taught spiritual practice. They were the stars of many people's eyes. Many people decided that they ordained hoping to be like them. Now as life goes on, time starts to disappear. Half a month before the Buddha's parinibbana, Sariputta Maharatan Vansi passed away in his parents' home. But at this time, Mahamoggallana Maharatan Vansi had a small meeting with Mara. See, Mara decided that he was going to go into the stomach of Mahamoggallana. So Mara instantly went in the stomach of Mahamoggallana, and the moment he went into the stomach, Mahamoggallana, the great Moggallana, told him immediately to get out. Mara was astonished to be discovered that quickly, and he was under the delusion that even the Buddha won't be able to do this quickly. Again, Mahamoggallana told him to get out. So Mara reluctantly came out of the mouth of Mahamoggallana, and the great Arhat Moggallana told him that he had known Mara in his past lives as well, that their connection was very old and deep. Because in the first Buddha, in this Bhadrakalpa, or this it's called the festival Eon, Mahamoggallana was called Dusti, and had a sister called Kali, who had a son who became the Mara of our time. So the Mara that we have now is basically his uncle, would be Mahamoggallana, who passed away, right? So Dusti, at the time of the first Buddha in this Bhadrakalpa, possessed a small boy and threw shards of a clay pot at the chief disciple, who at the time was called Vidura. Seeing this action, the Buddha just looked at this Dusti, and he dissolved and reappeared in the deepest hell. Now, at this moment, Mahamoggallana was again reminded of the suffering that he went through in the great hells, and yet he was now free from it. He was now free. He reminded himself that he was free from his great hells, that he's now going to be reborn again. Soon Mara left, extremely scared, and left. But yet Mahamoggallana soon after felt that his time was running out. But as he was an arhat, he didn't mind. He didn't care. Now, before we talk about how Mahamoggallana passed away, throughout the life of this great arhat, as you may know, he was just second to the Buddha in supernatural powers. He had powers beyond many people. I won't go through many stories about his supernatural powers, because he had powers like telekinesis. He could read minds. He could see things, he could see other beings, and so on and so forth. But I won't go through those stories. But I would like you to also imagine that imagine, right? At one point, the Buddha didn't have Buddha and his disciples didn't have had anything to eat because of an event that happened previously, and so Mahamoggallana said that to the Buddha, Buddha, if you want, I could split the world in half, and take out the essence of and give it to you. The Buddha declined this. He said, what's going to happen to all these animals then? He said, then Mahamoggallana said that I'll make another world exactly like this and replace them all there. And the Buddha again declined, said, no, we're not going to do that. And then Mahamoggallana again gave the idea, why don't I open the gates to go to another world, and we can have arms there. Again the Buddha declined. And then also there's other stories like the great King Sakra. Yeah, he was enjoying the pleasure of his heavenly plane and not able to feel the suffering that he wasn't going. He wasn't following the path through the Dharma. So Mahamoggallana just went to there, and he just literally placed his big toe onto the throne, and the whole palace started to shake. Now think about the amount of power that he had. Now I would like you to put yourself in his shoes. Imagine you had the power like that. What would you have done? I would like you to take a moment and think about it, right? What would you have done? You had the power to do almost anything. Like, what would happen when you felt like when you were bored? What would happen when you were angry, when you were happy, when you were sad? You would do many things that you would in the future regret. Because power is destruction of many people. Like I remember a quote that says, greed is the root of all evil. Now, like, to be honest, when I was reading the stories of the great Arhat, I was surprised to see like how little stories that he had of his supernatural powers. Because if you think about it, if you had this much powers, how many stories would they make about you? Like, how many things would you have done? But Mahamoggallana didn't do anything for his own benefit, or just to show off, or just to show that he had these powers. He did it for others, whether it's by explaining, showing them something that they didn't understand, or whether it's helping the Buddha in some other way. It wasn't for his own benefit. It was entirely for others. So he spent his life nobly. From the time he met the Buddha to the end of his life, he spent his life he spent a very noble life. He spent a very happy life. Now, as we reach the end of his life, right? So, as we all know, the Buddha have went into parinibbana, going through like a meditative state, and Sariputta passed away in his parents' house, and Ananda at the age of 120, I think, had his body vanish. Like, he made his body vanish, so they didn't have to, people didn't have to worry about his body. So they all seem so very calm and nice, right? But the way Mahamoggallana passed away was very different. He was to pass away a fortnight after Sariputta, Maharatan Mahasaya. Now, imagine, right? He was alone in the forest, in a forest hut, right, in a place called Black Rock, on the mountain Isagiri. Now, at the time, many other religious spiritual teachers really disliked Mahamoggallana, because he used to they almost thought that he used to steal their followers. He stole their followers from them. He stole their benefits. He stole their fame from them. And so, and as they were spiritual teachers and they had many followers, they couldn't do anything to him themselves. So they paid a group of robbers or group of thieves to do something to him, or to kill him, basically. So imagine, right? Day number 1, right? He was meditating in this forest hut, and he could hear these people coming. And as they reached his hut, he slipped through the keyhole. And so these thieves came into this hut, and to find it surprisingly empty. Disappointed, they left. But they came the second day. But Mahamoggallana, before they entered, he escaped through the roof. So again, the thieves came. Again, it was empty. Again, the third day, fourth day, some stories say for months, some stories say he came 7 times, but he escaped because he was not scared of death. He wasn't in the fear of dying. He escaped out of the complete compassion for these thieves, because, as you may know, killing an anahat is an anantipapkarma, which means you'll be born in the worst hell, and you'll be there for eons. So out of the compassion for these thieves, he escaped. But seeing that there's no use of escaping, he decided to let nature take itself. So the next time, he let the thieves take his life. But before that, he went into meditation and tried to investigate why. Why are they coming after me and trying to kill me? And he saw that in a previous life, many eons ago, he had a mother and father who were blind. He loved his parents so much. Like you and I love our parents, he loved his parents so much. He used to take care of them, and like whenever they help them in the needs and walk, and if they want to go somewhere, help them walk. But soon these parents decide, son, you're old enough, you should get married. After declining the offer 2-3 times, because it felt like, and because it was their wish, he decided that he was going to marry. Now the woman he married seemed nice, but soon after, few months maybe, she said that, you know what, I can't live with your parents anymore. They can't do anything for themselves. They can't go to the toilet, they can't cook, they can't clothe themselves because, you see, they're blind, right? I can't live my rest of my life looking after them. So, husband, you make your decision. Right? Whether you want me, or whether you want them. Now, after a lot of thought, after thinking again and again and again, he decided that he's going to get rid of his parents. Now, he had to find a way to get rid of them without them knowing what happened. So he decided that he's gonna plan a trip with his parents. So they decide they're gonna go on this trip, and they go in the middle of a forest. Now, as they go through this forest, in the middle of this dark forest, he shouted, "Mom, Dad, well, Mother, Father, there are thieves around us. They're gonna take our stuff. And they're gonna kill us all." And he goes into the forest and gets a stick and starts beating his parents. Beating his parents until they drop dead onto the floor. And a group of bypassers got to see this. And they vowed, look at the thing this young man did. He killed his parents. This is not right. We will take revenge. We will revenge for his mother and father. But to be honest, this man did not need revenge. Because after that, for many eons, he was born in the great house. Because again, killing a mother and father is an ananti papa karma, which means it's one of the 5 heinous acts. Which means he was destined to be born in the great house. It was his destiny, right? So he was born there, and even after being born in the great house, even after he was born as a human, he was again murdered. And even until his last life. So in his last life, so let's come back to the story, right? In his last life, he's now sitting in this hut, waiting for death. Or will now greet death like a friend. So now the thieves come, and they were promised money if they killed this Arhat, right? But they decide not, because think about it, right? They're thieves. They obviously have daggers, and they probably have like knives and stuff like that. But they decided to go and get again massive sticks, logs, and beat this Arhat, the Mahamoggalana, until it says his bones were the size of grains of rice. Think about it. They could have killed him any other way, but he decided to murder him with a grain of rice. Because these thieves are promised money. After that, they threw the body into the forest and fled, hoping that they're going to receive the money. But with the power and with the life he has left, Mahamoggallana pulled his body together and went to the went to the Buddha. Sorry. And the Buddha told him to give the last sermon and to show his physical power, his supernatural powers. So, as asked, he gave a last sermon and showed some of his supernatural powers. And he asked permission finally from the Buddha to pass away. The Buddha gave him permission. So therefore, he passed away. And that's the end of the great Arhat. He will now not be born again. He has stopped his journey through samsara. So his book of life is ended as a full stop. And the book's now closed and put onto a shelf. It's not going to be written again. He have left samsara. Now even in his last moment, only the karma only was able to affect the body. His mind, he was pure in his mind. He had no anger toward these thieves. But no matter what, no matter how he passed away, he's not going to be reborn again. You see, the great Arhat has passed away, have left samsara, while we are still there, going through. Now, I hope the story you were able to collect qualities from the great Arhat, Mahamoggallana. You're able to collect some of he throughout the story he had many great qualities. I hope you're able to collect some of them, and I hope through the story you are able to see the great qualities, and like the people back in the past. I hope that this will make him one of your role models as well. Now, I hope that I know I didn't do the full justice to his qualities, but through the things the story I've retold, I hope you're able to understand and collect the qualities, and hope that you're able to put these qualities into your life. And I hope that through the story you also decided that you're going to strive no matter what. Just like Kolita strived to have his burning question answered. Strive through dust, strive through the winds, strive through the rains. I hope you also strive to attain your salvation as well. I hope you all will strive and give great effort for your Nibbana as well. Okay. That brings us to the end of today's sermon. So before we end, let's take a few moments to transfer merits and close the sermon. Okay. Let us take a moment to transfer the merits that we've all acquired by making offerings to the infinite virtues of the Noble Triple Gem, chanting prayer, listening to the Dharma, and engaging in various meritorious deeds today. So first and foremost, let us remind ourselves how incredibly fortunate we are to be in receipt of the Lord Buddha's teachings. And with immense gratitude, let us transfer these merits to the Bhikshu, Bhikshunis, Upasakas, Upasikas, who since time immemorial have protected and preserved the sublime teachings of the Buddha and passed it down to the generations of the noble lineage to inform the Tripitaka, which is thankfully available to us today to study, understand and comprehend the Dharma. Let us also transfer the merits that we have acquired to all the members of the Mahasangha present throughout the world, including the chief prelates of all the chapters who have dedicated their lives to the noble path and have committed themselves towards the betterment of all sentient beings. Let us not forget among them are monks and nuns resident at your local temples and nunneries, who have always been by your side through thick and thin, come rain or shine. Let us also transfer these merits to Guru Swami Mahanse and all the other monks resident in this monastery, as well as the Anagarikas attached to the monastery. Let us also take a moment to transfer these merits and express our gratitude to those who made great efforts to disseminate the teachings of the Buddha, be that by transliterating these sermons, sharing them out with others, inviting them to join them. May through the power of these merits, if any of them have been born on the willful plane, may they redeem themselves and be born in the blissful plane. May by the power of these merits, may they abstain from unmeritorious deeds, fulfill the meritorious deeds, fulfill the noble eightfold path, and attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Let us also transfer the merits we have acquired to our devotees, friends of the monastery, who for the sake of merits continue to sustain the Mahasangha. This includes every one of you who have contributed to this construction of the monastery, to those of you who provide the Mahasangha with shelter, alms, robes, medicines, as well as those who passed their know-hows and extended their well-wishes. May through the power of the merits, may they abstain from the unmeritorious deeds, fulfill the meritorious deeds, fulfill the noble eightfold path, and attain supreme bliss in Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Let us also take a moment to transfer merits to our mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, sons, daughters, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, nephews, nieces, our elders, friends, acquaintances, employers, employees, and to all those who have helped us, supported us, assisted us in any way, shape or form. By the power of their merits, may they be healed of any physical or mental ailments. May they overcome the obstacles in their spiritual progress. May they abstain from the meritorious deeds, fulfill the meritorious deeds, fulfill the noble eightfold path, and attain the supreme bliss Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Let us also take a moment to transfer merits to the Devas, Brahmas, spirits, demons, and primarily the Sakra Deva, as well as the numerous gods and deities who have committed to protect and fulfill the Buddhist asana. Let us transfer merits to our guardian deities who keep a watchful eye over us, keep us out of harm's way. May through the power of the merits, may they prosper in divine power and wisdom. May by the power of the merits, may they abstain from the meritorious deeds, fulfill the meritorious deeds, fulfill the noble eightfold path, and attain supreme bliss Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Let us also take a moment to transfer merits to our ancestors who predeceased us, to all those who have been our family, friends, acquaintances in this infinitely long journey in samsara, and those who have helped us, supported us, assisted us in any way they could. Let us transfer these merits. Let us also transfer these merits to the member of the armed forces as well as the police force who have sacrificed their lives to protect the peace and harmony of our nation. May all those who have lost lives in the war, be their friend or foe, rejoice in the merits they have acquired today. Let us also transfer merits to those who have lost their lives in natural calamities such as tsunamis, earthquakes, landslides, and pandemics, reminding ourselves among them will be those who have been friends and family to us in this long journey in samsara. Let us take a moment to transfer merits to them. May through the power of these merits, if any of them have been born on the willful plane, may they redeem themselves and be born on the blissful plane. May they abstain from the unmeritorious deeds, fulfill the meritorious deeds, fulfill the noble eightfold path, and attain supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Finally, let us also resolve that may through the power and the blessings of all the merits we have acquired throughout the day, we be able to witness the event of many hundreds and thousands of Arhatans in this blessed land itself. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And finally, may through the power of all the merits we have acquired today, you and I and everyone who have helped make this program a success, become an Arhatan Vanse, become an Arhat Mahin Vanse in this very life and in the era of the Gautama Supreme Buddha itself. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May the blessings of the Noble Triple Gem be with you all. We'll now conclude the sermon there.